Saito is a weak bum who gets summoned to a magic academy by a mage who treats him like a peasant. However, when he discovers a secret ability to master any weapon he touches, every baddie on campus begs him to use his special sword to clap them. It all starts on the first day of a new session in the Tristane Magic Academy. After welcoming her students to their second year, a teacher named Chevreuse calls a distracted chick named Louise to come try out an alchemy spell. Just then, the entire class tells her to pick someone else because Louise has never been able to perform a proper spell since she was born. Upon hearing this, Louise gets pissed and decides to prove them wrong. But instead of replicating the spell like Chevreuse did, she turns the entire class into a disco ballroom. After the class goes up in smoke, Augusta immediately tells Chevreuse that they warned her, only to see that she has already lost consciousness from the shock. Meanwhile, Principal Osman's secretary has just finished playing with his secretary's buns and suddenly remembers that the second years have to summon their familiars tomorrow. Hours later, Louise walks out of the detention room and Augusta shows up with her squad to laugh before saying that she will definitely fail at the familiar summoning tomorrow. However, Louise suddenly claims that she will summon the greatest familiar they have ever seen, and Augusta ends up thinking about it for the rest of the night. The following afternoon, everyone in class gathers in the courtyard to summon their familiars, and after they all successfully perform the ritual, Augusta sees Louise hiding and asks if she has already forgotten her promise to summon the greatest familiar their world has ever seen. Louise then walks out to perform the ritual, and they all prepare to watch another epic fail. But this time, things take a weird turn as she ends up summoning our worthless MC Saito. After everyone mocks her as usual, she tries to end the ritual, but Colbert reminds her that it's a sacred ceremony that can only be performed once, meaning that she is now stuck with him. While Louise struggles to come to terms with this, Saito gets freaked out by the fact that he can't even understand the language, so he tries to sneak out, but Louise stops him to complete the ritual with a kiss. The next moment, he senses a powerful energy flowing through his body and starts yelling in pain until a mark appears on his hand and causes him to pass out. Hours later, he wakes up in Louise's room and continues freaking out, so she tries to shut him up with a silencing spell, but it turns into an explosive spell like all her other failed attempts at magic. However, when he gets back up and tries to attack her, she realizes that they can finally understand each other's language and carefully explains his situation to make sure he understands that she basically owns him. Just as she takes a moment to catch her breath from all the talking, he runs out the door to escape, but ends up seeing Gooch working his magic on an innocent first year too stupid to realize that he is a playboy. After Saito slips past him, Louise tells him to stop being so useless all the time, so he joins her to chase Saito and eventually uses levitation magic to capture him. Several minutes later, Saito explains he came from a place named Japan and tells Louise to send him back ASAP, but she tells him to forget about it and suddenly starts stripping. While covering his eyes, he asks how she can be so comfortable stripping in front of him, so she reminds him that he is nothing but a worthless slave she now has to tolerate. After telling him to make sure her clothes are washed for tomorrow, she climbs into bed, but he gets pissed and says he will never do her laundry. However, when she reminds him that she is the only one capable of taking care of him, he reluctantly agrees and crawls onto a mat to sleep. The following morning, he wakes her up with clean clothes and says she has to take the chain off him since he doesn't have anywhere to run to, but she asks for her plot armor first. After he hands them over, she tells him to dress her up, but he once again tries to refuse, so she promises to take off the chains if he stops arguing over every single command. Minutes later, she takes him to the breakfast hall, and he gets excited to see the luxurious feast they are having, until she points to the ground and reminds him that peasants don't get to sit at the table. After munching on stale bread for breakfast, he follows her outside and asks why she didn't just leave him in the room, before asking why everyone is playing with their familiars. Just as she explains that they have to spend the day building a strong bond with their familiars, Augusta shows up with her flaming salamander to show off as usual. As soon as she leaves, Louise takes her anger out on Saito and orders him to get her some tea, so he leaves and accidentally bumps into a maid on the way out. He immediately helps her with the spilled cake, but she recognizes the sign on his hand and asks if he is the peasant familiar everyone is talking about. After he introduces himself, Gooch starts demanding for his cake, so he offers to take it, but Siesta reminds him that it was just on the floor. Saito still insists on taking it to him as revenge for what he did last night, and Gooch barely notices as he cooks up diabolical lies to keep his girl, Margarita, from realizing that he is a professional grade cheater. Just as she mentions a rumor about him raising up a first-year girl, Saito thanks him for the save last night and says he finally understands the class ranking system, because the brown cloak on the girl from last night obviously means she was a first year. This causes Margarita to get even more suspicious, and like that isn't enough, Katie starts searching for him, so he quickly grabs Margarita to sneak inside. Unfortunately, Saito directs her right to him, and when she offers to feed him the sweet treats she made, Saito asks if that was why he seemed so intoxicated with her last night. As both girls start interrogating him, he tells Saito to stop running his mouth, but Saito doubles down and tells him to do a better job at double dating next time. The next moment, Margarita shuts down his nervous system with a brutal slap that attracts the rest of the class to watch the humiliating spectacle. To redeem his already tarnished reputation, Gyuch challenges Saito to a duel and immediately starts heading to the fight court. Just then, Luis grabs Saito and says he has to apologize, but he refuses and asks for directions to the fight court. In a matter of seconds, they both get surrounded by the entire class, and everyone gets excited to see if Gyuch is as good at fighting as he is with the ladies. However, Luis suddenly starts begging Gyuch to stop because there is no way Saito can win against his magic. Thankfully, Saito still refuses to back down, so Gyuch summons an armored golem that immediately shatters his ribs with a brutal punch. While the fight continues, Colbert has just shown Osmond the sign that appeared on Saito's wrist and reminds him that it has only ever appeared on a legendary familiar spirit. By then, Saito's face has started changing shape, so a nerd chick named Tabita starts heading out with her dragon. But despite this, Saito still refuses to back down, so Gyuch hands him a sword out of pity and gives him the option to back down if he apologizes for the disrespect. As soon as Saito reaches for the sword, Luis holds him back and tells him to apologize because Gyuch will really go all out if he picks it up. But he refuses and says he will never bow to a worthless pimp before grabbing the sword. Just then, he notices a sudden increase in his strength and cuts down Gyuch's golem with a single slice. After he easily slices through the rest of them, Gyuch admits defeat like the useless beta he is, so Saito drops the sword and suddenly passes out. 3 days later, he wakes up in bed and sees Siesta, who then tells him how long it's been and explains how Luis has been taking care of him. Several minutes into his usual laundry duty, all the other students start heading to class with their familiars, so she grabs him by the ear to join them. Shortly after that, Miss Chevreuse starts a new lecture in class, and Margarita quickly reminds everyone that her brain works except when Gyuch plays it, but as she sits back down, Saito notices why the weak beta is obsessed with her vanilla buns. Louise notices the creepy staring and immediately crushes his nuts before Augusta suddenly says that someone in class is too stupid to pull off beginner-level spells. The next moment, everyone starts looking at Louise, causing Saito to realize that his master is even more useless than him. As soon as they leave class, he teases her about it, but when she suddenly decides to starve him for the next few days, he remembers his place and begs for mercy. Hours later, he realizes that she is actually serious and tries to beg again, but she tells him to forget about it and focus on dressing her for bed. After obeying her orders, he reminds her of her responsibility to make sure he is okay. So she decides to let it slide until he gets a little too excited and says that she has more of a shot at growing her milkers than she has with magic. As extra punishment for the disrespect, she makes him sleep outside, but Siesta, who happened to be passing by, takes him down to the kitchen for an all-you-can-eat buffet. He gets surprised by the hospitality from all the workers until the head chef, Marteau, says they all became a fan after he defeated Gyuch and showed that you don't need special abilities to stand up to magic users. Saito then tries to explain that he doesn't even know how he did that. But Marteau's love reaches new heights, and he suddenly asks for a smooch on his hot mouth. After pushing him away, Saito quickly finishes the meal and heads out with Siesta to thank her for nursing him back to health. However, she tells him that it was actually Luis that brought him back from the other side with a very expensive potion. Upon hearing this, he tells her not to give Louise any credit because she probably has a lot of money lying around, but then she suddenly asks if they can have a more personal discussion sometime in the future. This catches Saito off guard, but he manages to stay composed and once again thanks her before heading back inside. Just as he reaches the hallway, he sees Augusta's familiar and tries to run, but it quickly pins him down and carries him all the way to her room, where she had been waiting to show off her chocolate-flavored buns. Despite seeing the obviously freaky lingerie, he acts dumb and asks what she wants. So she gets close and says she has been dreaming of his meat stick ever since the fight with Gyuch. However, just as she tries to get a kiss, her boyfriend starts showing up for the usual workouts, so she tries to cook up a lie but ends up blasting them all away from the window. Sensing the danger, Saito quickly reminds her that he already has a master he is kinda loyal to, but upon seeing the huge chocolate racks on her chest, his brain turns off. Unfortunately, as soon as Augusta locks lips with him, Louise shows up and orders him to go back with her. When Augusta refuses to let him go and pulls his head into her jugs, Louise explains how he will likely get butchered by her magic-using boyfriends for stealing their community kitty. This causes Saito to return to reality, so he follows her to the room, where she immediately starts whipping him for letting his meat stick control him. After begging her to stop, he finally grabs a hold of her arm and asks if she is jealous that he gave someone attention, but she responds by crushing his nutsack and stomping on his head, while explaining how her family and Augusta's had been beefing since the dawn of time. Moments later, he explains how Augusta's salamander dragged him to her room, and when she asks why he couldn't find a sword to defend himself, he claims to have no idea how he even won the fight against Gyuch, causing her to realize that he's still the pathetic weakling he was when she first summoned him. She then takes a moment to think before telling him to go to bed, because they have to wake up early for something. As he immediately grabs some straw to head out, she tells him to stay in the room in case Augusta tries to get freaky again, but he misunderstands and thinks she actually has a soft spot for him, so she decides to beat some sense into his empty skull. Early the next day, Augusta gets ready to go win his heart, but after seeing him leaving with Louise, she quickly runs to Tabitha's room to ask for help following them. After she cooks up a sob story about how Louise is keeping her from her one true love, Tabitha summons her dragon to track them down. Hours later, Louise and Saito make it to a merchant town, and after a couple minutes of walking around, she finds the weapon store and takes him inside to find a sword. The beaver hybrid who owns the store initially gives him a sword that looks like a fancy toothpick, and when Louise demands for the best one, he decides to rip her off and pulls out the most fancy piece in the store before claiming that it's almost the same price as a small mansion. The price obviously shocks Louise, so she tells him her budget, and he proceeds to pick out a condemned sword. When Saito starts complaining about how old it looks, he swears that it's actually a hidden gem no one seems to notice, so Louise reluctantly agrees to pay for it. On the way out, Saito continues whining, so she admits to being a little low on cash and tells him to shut the hell up, but he suddenly remembers when Siesta told him that she spent a fortune on the healing potion that revived him. As they make their exit, Augusta, who arrived just in time to see them leave the store, decides to get the fanciest sword money can buy. By evening, she presents it to Saito and clowns Louise for being a cheap master, while Tabitha reminisces on how she used her plot cans to deceive the brainless store owner into selling it for cheap. Just as both girls start arguing over who gets to take care of Saito, the rusty sword tells them to shut the hell up so he can sleep. They both immediately get close to make sure it's not a case of collective madness, and after the sword introduces itself as Delfinger, Saito agrees to keep it while Louise wonders why she always gets the abnormal stuff. Days later, Osmond signs an agreement for a wealthy count named Mott, who then thanks him before turning to leave. Upon reaching the door, he sees Secretary Milk Bags and immediately asks her to dinner, so she quickly covers her assets and thanks him for the offer. Once inside, she asks Osman what he came for, but he tells her to focus on a mage thief that recently started stealing valuable stuff from magic users. She then tries to figure out who they could be, but Osman starts teasing her cakes with a toy, so she decides to beat him up again. By sundown, many hours later, Saito tries to wash silk lingerie, but he quickly gets confused, so Siesta shows up and helps him with it before asking where he came from, because every regular person should know how they wash silk clothes. Instead of going through the whole process of explaining 21st century Japan, he simply tells her he came from a faraway land, but then she suddenly thanks him for everything he has done since he showed up. After she also claims to feel a lot better about her job because of him, he heads back inside and wonders why something seemed off with her. The next moment, Augusta opens her door to lure him in, and when he tries to make a run for it, she reminds him of the sword she bought and offers to give it to him since she won't be using it anytime soon. After following her inside to collect the sword, he asks why she is obsessed with pleasing him when she already has an army of loyal high-level simps, so she starts explaining how she has never clapped a low-level peasant before. Upon realizing that he is just an experiment to her, he gets up to leave, but she stops him and starts offering all her valuable items as gifts to change his mind. Despite all this, he still refuses to stay with her.
Come on, man.
So she pounces and admits that she enjoys it when he plays hard to get. Louise then shows up to rescue him and asks why he even wanted the sword since he had already chosen Delfinger. The next morning, she tells him to stay outside with all the other familiars, but after she leaves, he quickly gets fed up with the other familiars and starts heading inside when Marteau suddenly offers to feed him again. In the kitchen moments later, he stuffs his face as fast as possible before asking for Siesta because he hasn't seen her all day. Just as he apologizes for forgetting that she doesn't work in the kitchen, Marteau tells him that she actually quit and went to work for Count Mott just before sunrise. Later in the afternoon, he tells Elise about it and asks why she would just go to work for someone like that. So Delfinger explains how sudden job placements like that definitely mean that she is going to be draining Mott's pipe for the rest of her life. A couple minutes later, Geach starts working his magic on Margarita again, and when Saito shows up, he panics, but Saito tells him to relax because he just wanted to ask a couple questions. Shortly after their conversation, Louise notices that he hasn't come back inside for dinner, just as Augusta also shows up with a feast she prepared to win him over. Louise immediately tells her to stop trying to deceive him, but Augusta tells her that there is no point fighting over it since he isn't even here. They then try to figure out where he could have gone until Gitch says he was asking for directions to Count Mott's estate. While Augusta immediately starts laughing at Louise for losing her familiar to a count, she realizes why he went there and runs off to stop him. Over an hour later, Saito makes it to the estate, but immediately gets greeted by a guard, who then takes him to see Count Mott. As soon as he asks for Siesta back, Mott gets pissed and tells him to be grateful that his guards don't rip him to shreds on the spot, but Saito continues begging and promises to do whatever he asks if he agrees to let Siesta go back to the academy. When Mott tells him to forget about it and says she will please him until he gets tired, Saito tries to attack, but gets held back by the guards. Mott then decides to punish him severely, but Siesta runs out to beg on his behalf. After she also promises to do whatever he wants, Mott tells Saito about a special book belonging to a powerful family and promises to let Siesta go if he can retrieve it from the family's daughter, who is currently a second year in the academy. The moment he mentions the family's name, Saito runs out as he remembers that it's the book Augusta showed him, but Louise shows up on a horse and takes him back to her room, where she tells him to forget about Siesta because there's nothing they can do about it. However, the moment she falls asleep, He sneaks off to Augusta's room to ask for the book, and she easily pulls it out before explaining how useless it is to her. After saying that the book gets guys in a freaky mood, she shows him that her cakes can do a much better job of waking little Johnny before pulling him close and saying that he can have the book if he agrees to date her. The next moment, he gets pissed and says all powerful magic users are the same before grabbing the sword she got him and storming out. Minutes later, Tabitha sees him running off on Luis's horse and heads over to her room with Augusta to remind her that Mott can legally murk him as soon as he draws the sword to fight. While they immediately take off on Tabitha's horse, Saito makes it inside the estate and easily gets caught by the guards, who then take him inside to see Mott. Without so much as a negotiation, he pulls out the sword to fight, but suddenly senses a strange level of fear that causes his entire body to shake violently. Mott then reintroduces himself as a powerful mage and knocks over a vase before attacking him with the water. Just as he prepares ice swords to finish Saito off, Luis runs inside to save him and begs Mott to show mercy to her brain-dead slave. When Mott refuses and tells her to start calling her folks to discuss punishment, Augusta pulls out the special book he asked for and introduces herself to him. As soon as he collects it and agrees to let it slide, Saito asks for siesta, and he also tells the guard to send her back before pulling out a corn magazine. Upon seeing it, Saito realizes that it was definitely summoned from the regular world, which means there might be hope for him after all. Back at the academy later that night, Siesta thanks him with a kiss, and he remains delirious because of it, so Louise decides to starve him until he starts hearing voices from the other side. A couple nights later, the mage thief known as Sandy breaks into another estate to steal a prized necklace as preparation for a major heist. At the academy the following day, Louise gives up on teaching Saito to march and takes a moment to think before accepting that he is completely useless. When he asks why she is so fixated on teaching him a skill, she tells him about the annual exhibition where all second-year students have to display the special talent of the familiars they summoned. After he tells her to forget about it, she explains how important it is and says she is tired of being laughed at by all the other students. Saito then comes up with an idea to sing a song while washing her plot armor, since it's the only thing she ever taught him how to do. However, as soon as he finishes presenting the song, she pulls out the whip to flog the stupidity out of his brain. While trying to beg for mercy, he trips over his sword, and it suddenly gives her an idea. So she asks if he can just show off the sword skills he used on Geach instead. Unfortunately, the fact that he almost became human kebab in Mott's estate prompts him to tell her that the fight with Geach was an unexpected streak of luck, so she tells him to figure something out before heading to class. After hours of dancing around the courtyard, he gives up and asks Delfinger for help, but the rusty old sword calls him stupid for even asking that, and says he is only built for actual combat. Just then, Siesta shows up and asks what he is up to, but he immediately remembers her kiss from the other night and steps back to resist her charms. However, she only asks if he is practicing for the exhibition and wishes him luck, because all the other students are working hard to impress Princess Henrietta. Meanwhile, Longueville has just started listing out the preparations to be made ahead of Henrietta's visit, but Osmond focuses on his familiar, who is currently trying to see her goods, the moment she notices and tries to squash the freaky mouse. It runs back to Osmond and apologizes for not getting a good look, before Longueville takes her anger out on him. By then, Siesta has just finished showing Saito how much effort the other students are putting in to please Henrietta, so she grabs his hand to wish him luck again before leaving to help with the other preparations. Later that night, Colbert tells the guards protecting the academy's vault to focus on the main gates during Henrietta's visit, and when Longueville asks why, he reminds her that it's already fortified by incredibly powerful magic and claims that no thief would be stupid enough to attack the vault while the princess is around. The next day, all the students gather outside to welcome Henrietta, and as soon as she steps out of the carriage, Geach forgets that Margarita even exists, while Augusta deludes herself into thinking that her milkers make her more beautiful than Margarita. Saito, on the other hand, shamelessly gushes over her, so Luis tells him to stop but seems to be more excited than anyone else. After dinner, she returns to her natural hateful state as Saito continues to disappoint her with his pathetic sword skills, and once again suggests doing the plot armor concert. Just then, they hear someone knocking, so he opens the door and watches in shock as Henrietta runs in to hug Louise. Turns out they were very good friends several years ago and promised to always look out for each other no matter what. After Louise quickly drops to her knees and tells Henrietta that she shouldn't have come to such a low classroom, Henrietta tells her to stop the excessive glazing and says she has been waiting for a chance to meet her ever since her dad passed. When Saito tries to ask for more details about the relationship, Louise pins him to the ground for thinking a peasant like him has the right to speak. However, Henrietta tells her not to worry and admits that she has been curious to meet the famous familiar that pulled the sword against Mott. Upon hearing this, Louise asks how they didn't get into trouble if news already reached the palace, so Henrietta reminds her of their promise to look out for each other. Louise then forces Saito to show gratitude before seeing Henrietta out with a warm hug. Before leaving, she wishes Saito luck with the familiar presentation tomorrow, and he immediately tries to work his magic on her, only to get aggressively whipped and humiliated by Louise. The next day, all the students put on an amazing show with their familiars, and after Tabita's dragon steals the spotlight, Louise accepts that they will only receive insults, so she tells Saito to simply introduce himself and walk off stage. Moments later, she climbs on stage with him and tolerates the usual insults so they can leave as soon as possible. But Saito pulls out Delfinger to show off his new skill, only to end up embarrassing her even more. It gets to the point that even the weak playboy he once defeated joins to insult them, so Louise drags him out by the ear to end their humiliation ritual. At the same time, the mage thief has just realized that the lock on the academy vault is much too complex for her level of magic, so she quickly jumps out and summons a Titan-class golem to break into it, only to get stopped by an even stronger barrier. The next moment, Louise and Saito walk in on her failed attempt, so she immediately launches an attack while Tabita gets announced as the winner of the familiar tournament. Luckily, Saito manages to push Louise out of the way, but he gets captured by the golem, so Louise decides to stay and fight back to protect him. Despite knowing that she barely has any control over her magic, she conjures up a spell to blast the golem, but it misses and cracks the wall the mage thief had been struggling to put a dent in. She initially gets shocked by the power of Louise's failed blast, but decides to use it to her advantage by finally breaking into the vault. By then, everyone at the ceremony begins to wonder where the loud bang came from, so Tabita takes off on her dragon but ends up being a little too late, as the mage thief finally obtains the Staff of Destruction and drops Saito before leaving. Hours later, Osmond sees the letter she left to taunt him and receives word that the knights could only find a pile of rubble, which is likely the golem she summoned earlier. While he wonders how the kingdom's sacred treasure could get stolen so easily, Henrietta catches up with Louise to ask if she is okay, and when Louise apologizes for letting the thief get away, Henrietta tells her not to worry about it and leaves to make a formal report at the palace. Saito then notices the worried look on her face and asks if it's really that big of a deal, so she tells him about the slowly increasing hostility Henrietta has been facing. After realizing that being a royal isn't all sunshine and diamonds, he asks Louise why she didn't run when the golem captured him, so she reminds him of her duty as the mage who summoned him. In class the following day, Augusta resumes her mission to clap Saito by feeding him until Louise loses it and attacks him. Augusta then tells her to accept their new reality because they won't be receiving any lectures until the academy retrieves the sacred treasure. The next moment, Colbert rushes in and takes the both of them, as well as Tabita, to Osmond's office, where Longueuil explains the rumors she heard of a suspicious person living in an old hut out in the woods. After she hands over a sketch she was able to get, the girls immediately recognize the thief, so Colbert offers to alert the palace, but Osmond decides that they have to get it back themselves so the thief won't escape. However, when he asks for volunteers to go take her down, the usually boastful mages all remain silent until Louise raises her wand and offers to handle it on her own. Augusta immediately raises her wand as well to make sure Louise doesn't get all the credit, and Tabita decides to join just because the both of them might end up attacking each other instead of the thief. Upon seeing this, Osmond reveals that Tabita is actually a knight and also explains how powerful Augusta is, but his tongue gets tied when he tries to say something good about Louise, so he decides to focus on the fact that she managed to summon Saito. After Longueuil offers to lead them to the thief's hideout, they all get a carriage and begin the journey into town. Moments later, Saito asks why a noble would be stealing from other high-ranked members of society, so Longueuil tells him that not all mages are actually nobles. She goes on to explain how some of them lose their nobility and end up becoming criminals or regular peasants, but when she admits that she also lost her nobility, Augusta gets intrigued and asks how she managed to get a job as Osmond's secretary despite it. Ignoring the obvious fact that the old geezer is a sucker for young milkers, she claims he is just a naturally kind person, but Augusta continues asking how she lost her nobility until Louise tells her to stop being rude. She then decides to focus on getting freaky with Saito instead, and that naturally causes Louise to get pissed, so he holds them back from starting a fight. The next moment, Augusta gives him the sword she bought and says he will definitely need it because Delfinger might snap after a single attack. Shortly after that, they get to the hideout and Saito ends up being the lab rat they send to scope the scenery out. Luckily, he finds no one inside, so Tabita and Augusta join him to take a look inside, while Longueuil decides to investigate the surrounding forest. After minutes of looking through everything in the cabin, Tabita spots a conveniently placed chest and pulls out the sacred treasure, which surprises them since the thief wouldn't have just left it lying around. All of a sudden, the roof gets ripped off by another golem, so the girls immediately attack, but barely leave a scratch on it. As they try to come up with a plan to stop it, Louise shows up and tries to attack as well, but she misses as usual and causes the golem to focus on her instead. Upon seeing this, Saito tells her to run away, but she refuses and starts yapping about the importance of being a mage while the golem prepares to give her an instant burial. After another miserable attack, she realizes that it's too late to escape, but Saito saves her again and lands a brutal slap before saying that no one will miss her if she gets clapped without even putting up a proper fight. The next moment, she starts bawling her eyes out and says she is just tired of being a joke to everyone in the academy, so he comforts her and helps her get on Tabita's horse before deciding to take the golem down by himself. As the girls fly off, He pulls out Augusta's sword and charges in with every ounce of energy left in his body, but the sword snaps in half as soon as he lands the first strike. Just as his adrenaline rush turns to fear, Delfinger offers to help him out, but Saito hesitates and asks how he plans to help when the gold sword couldn't do a thing. Delfinger then asks if he has a better idea, so he agrees to it and finally activates the power he used against Geach. With his strength amplified, he tears through the golem with ease, but it quickly regenerates from all his attacks, causing him to realize that it might take a lot more than powerful slices to win. Louise notices this and grabs the Staff of Destruction from Augusta before jumping off the dragon with levitation magic. Just then, Saito takes a close look at the supposed staff and realizes that it's actually a rocket launcher, so he quickly grabs it from her and finally destroys the golem by blasting its head. After Augusta hugs him as a reward for being so talented and brave, they start to wonder why the thief wasn't with the golem until Longo grabs the launcher and says it was her this entire time. She then explains how she lured them out because she couldn't figure out how to use it, and after calling Saito a name used to address a legendary familiar, she tries to blow them up but gets disappointed when nothing comes out. As she tries to figure out why, Saito quickly knocks her out and explains that it only has one rocket equipped before they all head back to the academy. After thanking them for the save, Osmond promises to throw a banquet for the girls and tells them to expect rewards from the palace, but when they ask if Saito will be getting any, he reminds them that he is the only noble that doesn't discriminate. Saito then says that all he wants is answers, so the girls head out while he asks Osmond how the launcher ended up in their world. It all happened 30 years ago when Osmond was about to get eaten by a dragon, but got saved by a soldier who suddenly appeared with 2 launchers and passed out from his injuries. Osmond further explains how they buried him with the first launcher and kept the second as a sacred treasure, but the history lesson leaves Saito even more pissed than when he first arrived because he still can't find a clue to get back home. Hours later, Louise shows up for the ball and suddenly becomes the center of attention, but she ignores all her previous haters and heads straight to Saito, who then admits that she doesn't look like the usually toxic boss he sleeps with every night. When the music starts playing, he tells her to go dance with the other nobles, but she swallows her pride and asks him to dance with her instead, so he takes her to the floor and quickly masters the steps. She then apologizes for not believing what he said about being from another world and gets a little sad that he wants to go back. However, she decides to ignore her own feelings for once and thanks him for saving her, while Delfinger watches and wonders if he will ever find a sassy girl's sword to spin around like that. The following day, Henrietta invites them both to the palace to congratulate Louise on her promotion in rank and also commend their efforts in taking down Longbill. When she extends her hand and asks Saito to promise that he will always look after Louise, he gets confused by the gesture, so Louise explains that he has to kiss her as a show of respect. However, the slow-brained creep misunderstands and suddenly pulls Louise in for a sloppy kiss
Yeah, boy.
that instantly short-circuits her nervous system. Moments later, Louise redecorates his face and promises to unalive herself along with him if Henrietta wants, but she decides to let the kiss serve as his reward for everything. Louise still asks for a way to properly apologize for the blatant disrespect, so she tells them both to live in town for some time and hands Louise a royal ID before explaining how she started receiving rumors of some of the locals being mistreated by nobles. Due to the severity of punishments given to normies who stand up to nobles, no one has ever dared to fight back, so she begs them to go undercover and figure out what is really going on. Shortly after that, Louise changes into regular people's clothes and sets out with Saito to begin the mission, but they hit their first roadblock when she hears the outrageous price being paid for a horse. Moments later, even the regular hotel for nobles ends up being way out of their budget, so they spend most of the day looking for affordable luxury because Louise continues insisting that she can't sleep in peasant inns. When Saito starts complaining about it, she gets pissed and tells him to stop following her so she can think. But by evening, he finds her at a water fountain and learns that she blew all their money at a casino. After laughing at how stupid she was for thinking she could win something on her first try, he suggests asking Henrietta for help, but Louise refuses and says they have to find a way by themselves. Just then, a fruity man-beast named Scarin shows up and gushes over how good Saito looks before offering to give them a room on the condition that they have to work for him. Several minutes later, he receives a proper welcome from the army of baddies working for him and thanks them for being so kind before introducing Louise as the latest member of the family. While he explains the fake backstory she cooked up, Saito joins a chick named Jessica to wash dishes and quickly works his riz on her while Louise boils with jealousy. The next moment, Scarin tells everyone that they will be spending the week competing for who gets the highest tip and reveals a magical outfit as the ultimate prize. When he explains how its magic causes customers to empty their wallets for whoever wears it, Louise decides to win at all costs so she can return to a life of luxury. However, her motivation suddenly fades away after her very first client starts paying more attention to her perfect skin than the drink he ordered. When he tries to grab the melon seeds, she spills the wine all over him and tries to put him in his place, but Scarin quickly jumps in to distract the customer. Minutes later, Saito manages to calm her down and reminds her that it's the only way they can afford a place to stay, but she continues rambling about how miserable she feels, so he gives up and decides to turn in for the night. Shortly after that, he falls asleep, but she stays up wondering how he adapts so easily until a bunch of bats suddenly attack her. She then sneaks into his blanket to spend the night and goes on to spend the rest of the week traumatizing Scaren's customers, while Saito gets even closer to Jessica and gets shocked when she tells him that Scaren is actually her dad. During one of her shifts, Scaren decides to bench her since most of the customers already hate having to put up with her attitude and melon seeds, but this causes her to finally notice that Jessica's jugs are the reason Saito has been so obsessed with her, so she knocks him out with a bottle. Minutes later, he wakes up in her room, and after explaining what happened, she asks for the truth about his relationship with Louise. This catches him off guard, so he tries to remember the lie they started with, but Jessica tells him to forget about it because she already knows that Louise is actually a noble. She further explains how her bossy attitude was an instant giveaway, so Saito admits that it's true but tells her to stay away from them if she doesn't want any trouble. This only causes Jessica to get a lot more curious, so she crawls over to him and promises to let him hit if he tells her all about their secret mission. The next moment, Louise barges in and demands to know what they are doing, so he jumps out of the bed and claims that he was just gathering valuable intel from her. After saying that the only intel he collected is the texture of her jugs, Louise crushes his baby maker and tries to drag him out, but Jessica stops her and asks how she plans to win the tip contest with her surfboard chest. By the following evening, she loses hope since it's the last day and she still hasn't received a single tip. But then a human walrus named Turen suddenly walks in with his guards and chases everyone else away, while Scaren immediately starts stroking his ego. Jessica tells Saito how he torments the locals with his power as a noble and leaves them no choice but to accept the torture since he is in charge of tax collections. The next moment, Louise foolishly decides to serve him as she thinks he might be her ticket to the magic outfit, but her hopes get dashed when he takes one look at her flat chest and asks Scaren why he is hiring guys to dress up as chicks. When he still tries to check if there is anything there, she attacks him and immediately gets surrounded by his guards, so Saito jumps in to protect her but realizes that he left Delfinger in the room. Luckily, Louise kept her wand strapped to her legs, so she blasts Turen's teams before showing them Henrietta's letter and revealing who she really is. Turen immediately offers her all his money and promises to never trouble the locals again, so she lets him off with a warning and ends up winning the contest as she received more tips than any of the girls got throughout the week. Later that night, she puts it on for Saito, who then loses motor function in his brain the moment she steps out. The next day, they both make it back to the academy, but Louise gets tired of Saito grabbing her chesticles and kicks him off the horse. Just then, Augusta sees them and says she thought Louise had already left on vacation before giving Saito one last taste of her jugs and telling them that she is going to see Tabita's home. Shortly after that, she tells Tabita that she is also an exchange student before explaining how she got expelled from her previous school and became the black sheep of the family, which was why they sent her away. Just as she tries to ask for Tabita's backstory, a local farmer stops their carriage and explains to Augusta that there is a flood up ahead. Back in the academy at the time, Louise has just given Saito all her piled up laundry, and after she barks the usual orders, he heads out and wishes their mission could have gone on for longer. However, after seeing Gooch and Margarita having the usual fight, he decides that the academy isn't so bad after all. After Gooch chases her into the building to bay, he spots a huge bowl and suddenly comes up with an idea before getting permission from Marteau to use it. He then pushes it all the way to the back and tells Delfinger that he might finally be able to experience one of the pleasures from back home. Meanwhile, Augusta has just seen that the flood submerged a small settlement, but she gets more intrigued by the royal insignia on the outskirts of the estate. Moments later, they arrive at Tabita's family mansion, and Augusta realizes that she is a part of the country's royal family before her butler, Perserin, welcomes them both inside. After getting seated inside the mansion, Augusta sees a picture of her father and asks to meet him, but Tabita refuses and tells her to wait before heading inside. Perserin then serves Augusta a cup of tea and admits that he didn't expect Lady Charlotte to bring a friend with her, but Augusta gets shocked and asks if that's Tabita's real name. Upon realizing that she chose a different name for the academy, Perserin tells her that Tabita only enrolled in the academy because it was an order from her uncle, the current king of their nation. By then, Tabita has just entered her mother's chambers to greet her, but her mum loses it and accuses her of trying to unalive her daughter like they did to her husband. While Tabita continues listening to her hurtful words, Perserin tells Augusta that Tabita's dad got murked by his older brother 5 years ago because they had to fight over who would become the new king. Despite this, a lot of people still wanted to wipe out the entire family, and during a ball a little while after her dad got unalived, a conniving mage tried to poison Tabita, but her mum noticed at the last moment and drank it all. Although it didn't send her to the other side, she lost her sanity to the curse infused into the drink and has remained broken ever since. That wasn't enough. Tabita was forced to take on extremely dangerous missions by the same people, but because she managed to survive every single one, they sent her away to the academy. Just then, Tabita returns from her mother's chambers, so Augusta asks if they can go take a bath to wash off all the sweat from their journey. Hours later, Saito climbs into the makeshift bath he prepared and tries to get the full experience by dunking his head into the water. But Siesta sees it and gets closer to figure out what it is. The next moment, he jumps out and startles her in the process before quickly hiding his pickle. Despite knowing that he has nothing on, she still walks over to ask what it is, and after he explains, she asks to join him, and he accepts but believes there is no way she would actually climb into the bath with him. However, upon seeing that she has already taken off most of her clothes, he reminds her that his meat stick actually works, but she claims it won't be a problem because she trusts him. After climbing inside the bath, she convinces him to face her, so he quickly starts a conversation to keep his magnum from sticking out. Meanwhile, Margarita had just called Geach out for a late-night date where she plans to charm him with a special potion she cooked up. As she tries to find the perfect opportunity to slip it into his drink, Saito and Siesta continue making small talk. But a couple of minutes into their chat, Louise storms out to figure out what is taking him so long. Unlike all the other times she has caught him with a girl, she freezes in shock and quickly walks back after seeing the happy look on his face. Just then, Siesta tells him that her grandfather used to say he also fell out of the sky and was from another world. He immediately tries to ask more questions, but she stands up and says she has to get back to work. By then, Margarita had just slipped the potion into Geach's drink, but Louise suddenly shows up and drinks the entire thing before storming back inside. Minutes later, Saito gets back and tries to apologize for taking so long, but the potion suddenly alters her brain chemistry, so she hugs him and asks how he could betray her love. As he struggles to figure out what kind of madness she is displaying, Margarita shows up to fix the mess she made. Meanwhile, Augusta watches over Tabita as she sleeps and reminisces on the quest Perserin said her uncle wanted her to complete. She could already tell that it was going to be another indirect attempt to unalive her, so she offered to help and realized that she knew so little about her best friend. Just then, Tabita experiences a nightmare about the night her mother was poisoned, so she climbs into the bed to comfort her. Early the next day, Louise stops Saito from leaving so they can cuddle together in her bed, but he refuses and says he has important business to attend to, causing her fragile heart to shatter into a million pieces. While staying back to comfort her, he thinks back to the previous night when Margarita explained how she suddenly swallowed the entire glass that was meant for Geach. As soon as the words left her mouth, Geach claimed to be happy that she was willing to go that far for his love, but as he tried to reward her with a kiss, Saito interrupted to remind them that they needed to fix Louise. Unfortunately, Margarita had no clue how long the potion would last and told him to expect her to be normal again in a year. Back in the courtyard, Louise continues professing her love, so he decides to play along until Siesta shows up and starts twitching as she struggles to contain her anger. Upon seeing this, he tries to explain that it's all a misunderstanding, but Louise gets jealous and asks if the sloppy brain she plans to give him won't be enough. Her careless display of obsession eventually gets to Siesta, so she leaves, and after Louise also storms out in anger, Saito decides to follow the one with her senses still intact. When he tells Siesta that Louise is just under a spell, she gets pissed and tells him not to underestimate her intelligence because everyone knows that making love potions is strictly forbidden. After she walks out on him, he heads back to the room to receive another verbal assault from Louise, but upon opening the door, he sees that she has already prepared for the sloppy brain she promised and freaks out. She then explains that she had to go this far because he never tries to get freaky despite the fact that they live together, but he still tries to put her shirt back on, so she grabs him and swears that she has always wanted to do it. As she tries to get closer, he falls off the bed, and she almost starts crying again, but he quickly hugs her and promises to get her back to normal. Moments later, he barges in on Margarita and Geach's couple's time to say that she has to fix Louise immediately, but she refuses and insists that the only way is to wait for the effects to wear off. However, when he decides to go tell Osman about her illegal activities, she suddenly remembers a magic drug to fix it, but says they have to leave the academy to find the ingredients. Saito then suggests leaving tomorrow, but she tries to complain again, so he reminds her that he is the only thing keeping her from being expelled. Hours later, Louise decides to try a more freaky approach to lure him into bed, but he resists and only promises to watch over her, so she falls asleep while he wonders when the torture will end. The following morning, they all leave the academy on a bunch of horses and spend more than half of the entire day riding before getting to the special lake Margarita told Saito about. But after seeing that the water level is unusually high, she tells them that the spirit residing in the lake is pissed. They get confused by this, so Margarita further explains how she forged a contract with it in this same lake years ago. But seeing as it is currently flooding the entire town, it can only mean that the spirit has been provoked by something. Hours later, she drops some blood on her familiar and sends it into the water to find the spirit, who then reveals herself just a couple minutes later. As soon as she switches to a human form, Margarita reminds her of their contract and asks for her tears so they can help Louise, but the spirit refuses and tells them to leave. When Saito suddenly starts begging and promises to do anything in return, Margarita tries to stop him, but the spirit surprisingly accepts and tells him to stop the people attacking her because she is too busy flooding the area to handle them. Without even thinking about it, he accepts and immediately takes them all to the far edge of the lake. lake, but when he tries to cook up a plan with Margarita, Luis pulls him back and asks if she is his new side piece, so he once again pretends to love only her just to avoid another cringy breakdown. The next moment, they see two mages about to attack the water spirit again, so Saito immediately tries to stop them, but Geach holds him back and says they need a plan. This causes Saito to think he might not be so bad after all, until he decides to use his magic from the woods while Saito handles the main attack. When he tries to make it sound like he is actually putting in effort, Saito supports his delusion just to stop him from yapping. Geach then launches the first attack with an earthquake-bending skill, and after both mages easily block all of them, Saito pulls Delfinger out and unleashes a flurry of attacks. Despite this, he still gets blasted away, but as the mages prepare to finish him off, Luis unleashes a powerful blast that almost obliterates the surrounding woods. The next moment, they realize that it's just Augusta and Tabita, so they all explain everything that has happened so far before Augusta tells them that Tabita can't return home without stopping the water spirit. Moments later, they return to the lakeshore to ask why she is flooding everywhere in the first place, so she tells them about a special ring that got stolen from her by a man named Cromwell, and explains her plan to gradually flood the entire world because her ability to sense life force in water will help her locate it. When Saito promises to get her the ring back in exchange for the tears, as well as hitting pause on her planet flooding plans, they all call him stupid for thinking the great water spirit will take him seriously. To their surprise, she easily accepts his terms and says something about having experience with him in the past before giving them the tears and returning to the water. Back at the academy several hours later, Louise returns to normal and attacks Saito for taking advantage of her, until Henrietta suddenly jumps in from their window. Meanwhile, while Longville, who managed to escape prison, meets up with the same Cromwell the water spirit mentioned. When Louise asks Henrietta why she suddenly decided to show up instead of sending for them, she explains that it is a matter of great importance and asks them to keep it secret before saying that she has decided to marry into a powerful nation to protect her small kingdom. After Louise expresses how sad she is to hear that, Henrietta tells her that they have to receive a letter she sent to a prince years ago because it could destroy her marriage plans if anyone ever finds it. Saito then asks what she could have possibly written to cause that, and Louise responds by crushing his toes before Henrietta starts fighting back tears and says they're the only ones she can trust with the mission. Just as Louise humbly accepts to carry it out, Geach walks in and says he heard everything before offering to assist them. Both Louise and Saito immediately tell him to forget about it, but Henrietta accepts the offer, leaving them both at a loss for words. Shortly after that, Siesta finds Saito doing laundry as usual and apologizes for not trusting him about the love potion, but he tells her not to worry and suddenly remembers what the water spirit said about him. He then asks if she knows anyone in the academy with a lot of knowledge on their world's history, and ends up in Colbert's workshop the next morning. After he explains what the water spirit said, Colbert tells him about a magic element called the Void that has only been used by a powerful mage and his familiar, who has the very same insignia Saito had. However, seeing as they all know Luis to be the most useless mage, Colbert tells him that it might not be him after all. The next moment, Saito notices a familiar smell, so Colbert shows him a flask filled with a liquid called dragon blood. While he explains how it was found after two never-before-seen dragons fought in the sky, Saito takes a closer look and wonders how on earth they found gasoline. Before bed that night, Louise admits that she might end up failing Henrietta since she still can't use magic properly, but Saito reminds her of all the times they pulled through at the last minute and promises to protect her if it comes down to it. Early the next day, they all get to the gate, and Louise takes a moment to stare at the ring Henrietta gave her before wondering why the bodyguard she promised to send hasn't shown up yet. Just then, Geach's familiar crawls out of the dirt and suddenly attacks her, so Geach explains its obsession with jewelry and tells her to give it up. After refusing, Louise continues trying to fight it off until a powerful gust of wind blasts it away. The next moment, they see a griffin in the sky and watch as it lands before a mage named Wards climbs off and introduces himself as their bodyguard. While Geach immediately recognizes him as the famed Mage Knight, Louise remains frozen in shock until Wards walks over to her and says he has missed his lovely fiancée before picking her up. At that same moment, Augusta wakes up and boils over with envy as she watches Wards carry Louise off to get started on the mission. Minutes later, Geach continues glazing and slowly starts pissing Saito off, while Louise asks Wards why he came since the Griffin unit usually doesn't take on secret missions. After he says it was all just to see her again, she thanks him but notices that Saito is gradually getting close to a full crash out. Hours later, they finally make it to the port town closest to the nation Henrietta mentioned, so Wards decides to go find a spot to crash for the night, while Louise takes the opportunity to tell Saito that she didn't actually agree to a marriage with him. Despite feeling jealous, he manages to keep his emotions in check and admits that Wards is way more respectful than all the other nobles he has encountered. Much later, they get dinner at a local restaurant, and Saito continues to ignore Wards until he starts asking about all his recent takedowns and admits to being fascinated by how strong he is. When he suddenly asks for a duel and says they have more than enough time since the ship leaves tomorrow night, Saito agrees to it, so he gets up to leave and asks Louise to follow him for an important conversation. Shortly after that, Geach and Saito get a room together, but but the shameless playboy runs out to find a hot date for the night. So Saito asks Delfinger if he knows anything about the legendary familiar called Gandalf. While Delfinger explains that it's really him, Wards tells Louise that she has a special power no one else can even think of mastering before suddenly saying that they should get married after the mission. After rambling on about how she will help him achieve the greatest heights of nobility, he promises to always protect her and leans in for a kiss, but she suddenly remembers when Saito told her the exact same thing and says his name without realizing it. This causes Wards to hesitate, so she quickly tries to explain, but he tells her not to worry and leaves to get another room. The next day, they all find a spot for the duel, and Saito immediately launches an attack, but Wards easily blocks them all and pays close attention to learn how he moves. He then forces him back and says he won't even have to go all out before unleashing his own attacks, and eventually blasting Saito into a stack of barrels, causing Mr. Protector's aura to vanish right in front of Louise. Later that evening, Louise finds Saito crying and promises that his pathetic failure didn't change anything about their relationship, but he refuses to listen and tells her to go back to her fiancé. When she tries to pull him away from the railing, he pushes back and tells her to leave, so she gives up and says she will be accepting Ward's proposal before leaving. Shortly after that, Geach shows up and reminds him that they have to get on the ship early, but Longueuil suddenly shows up with a golem to attack them. Meanwhile, Wards had just told Louise that Saito and Geach have already gone back to the academy, causing her to believe that Saito actually abandoned her. As they start heading to the ship, Saito cuts off one of the golem's arms, but it quickly regenerates, so Geach summons his own army of golem knights to take it down. By the time his knights get destroyed, Augusta and Tabitha show up to help, but upon seeing that their fight has attracted unwanted attention, Longueuil decides to leave and says she only wanted to stall them. After taking a moment to think, Saito rushes back to the hotel to find Louise, but the manager tells him that she has already left, so he asks Geach where the ship is. Just then, it flies over them, leaving Saito confused until Augusta and Geach explain that the nation they were heading to actually floats, which is why they had to wait for the perfect time to board the airship. As soon as they notice that Louise and Wards are not around, Saito runs to the edge and screams her name. She hears it but struggles to see anything since they are already so far away, and when Wards notices, she swears that she was only checking and agrees to become his wife. Minutes later, Saito tells the others what Longueuil said before running off, and says they have to save Louise, but Augusta reminds him that they can't do anything until another ship arrives. The next moment, something forces up the ground, so Geach prepares himself for another golem attack before seeing that it's just his familiar. At the time, Wards and Louise have just toasted to their marriage, but when he starts asking if she knows where Prince Wales is, she refuses to say anything and tells him that Henrietta made her promise to keep it a secret from everyone. After he claims to be okay with it and leaves, she spends the rest of the night convincing herself that marrying him is the right thing to do. The next day, they finally make it to the floating kingdom of Albion and track down the abandoned chapel Henrietta told her about, but as soon as they step foot inside, a bunch of knights surround them. Wards then explains where they come from, but the commander refuses to believe him because no outsider should know where the chapel is. However, when Louise shows him the ring Henrietta gave her, he takes off his glove and takes his ring close to hers to activate the magic infused into the both of them. Prince Wales then takes off his helmet and apologizes for the hostility before taking her into his office where he reads the letter Henrietta gave to her. After he hands over the letter she was worried about, Louise asks if he plans to turn himself over to the nobles raising a coup against his family. He initially tells her to stick to delivering letters, but upon realizing that she is genuinely concerned, he explains that there is a secret group puppeteering the enemy nobles and says he has to fight to the end to protect his nation. On her way out, Ord shows up and suggests getting married in the chapel, but she refuses and says they have to wait until they get back home. The next moment, he grabs her and says his organization needs her, but then she remembers that it's the same group Wales just mentioned and refuses to marry him. She then tries to escape, but Cromwell shows up and takes over her mind with the ring he stole from the water spirit. Minutes later, Wales starts wedding, but after Ward says his vows, Louise realizes what is happening and tries to fight back. Unfortunately, the ring's power ends up being too strong for her, but Saito finally shows up and calls out her name until the spell breaks off. Wards immediately asks how he even found them, so he explains how Geech's familiar tracked the scent of Louise's ring. The next moment, Ward stabs Wales through the heart, but before entering the light, he gives Louise his ring and wishes her luck. Upon seeing that, Saito immediately tries to attack, but Wards easily knocks him down and says Longueuil should have murked him. When he tries to convince Louise to marry him again, Saito gets back up and fully activates his abilities, which gives Delfinger an instant makeover in the process. With his power level at its max, he easily blocks all of Ward's attacks and finally lands a powerful hit. But Wards manages to pull himself up and shows them Henrietta's letter before setting the chapel on fire and leaving. The next moment, a ceiling beam breaks off and nearly ends the lovebirds, but Augusta and Tabitha rescue them. Despite this, Louise gets emotional about Ward's betrayal, so Saito reminds her of his loyalty with a kiss. Early the next day, Louise goes to see Henrietta and breaks the bad news before losing control of her emotions. But Henrietta also breaks down, so they take some time to console each other. At the academy later that morning, Louise walks in on Colbert getting permission from Osman for an important mission, and after he leaves, she gives Osman a report of everything that happened. After he tells her to get some rest, she asks about the void because Cromwell said something about her being the one with its power before he fried her brain. Osman then stops her from finishing the story and says it must mean that Saito is really the legendary Gandalf. Shortly after that, she tries to get changed, but he suddenly walks in with her laundry, so she hides and asks what took him so long to finish. When he starts the usual argument, she starts to wonder how he can act so normal after the kiss they shared, but then he tells her to cheer up considering everything she just went through. This causes her to think there might be hope for her love life after all until her plot armor slips off. Moments later, she notices that its band got ripped and asks how, but he claims to have no idea before suddenly remembering that he actually ripped it up while washing a couple days ago. He then tries to explain, but she suddenly pulls out the whip to teach him some manners and says he should pay more attention to her stuff. When he refuses to accept the punishment and reminds her that he is only doing all this because he doesn't have a choice, she tells him to leave if he really doesn't like it. As he immediately agrees to leave, she attacks him with a pillow, and instead of lashing out on the spot, he walks all the way to his bath and takes the anger out on his foot. He then tries to figure out why he suddenly kissed her, but then Siesta shows up to tell him that she will be returning to her village for the holiday. After suddenly remembering what she said about her grandfather being from another world, he asks for all the details. At the same time, Geach begs Augusta and Tabitha to help him tell Margarita that he was on a mission with them because she now believes that he went to find a new mistress. Just as Augusta tells him to stop acting like he is loyal, they hear Siesta telling Saito about two dragons and decide to eavesdrop on their conversation. Siesta then tells Saito that her grandfather and another person suddenly appeared out of nowhere on a dragon, but while the other guy escaped through the eclipse, he crashed, and the dragon ended up being an heirloom kept in their village ever since. After Saito asks if she can take him to her village, Augusta also decides to follow them so she can see the dragon as well. Shortly after that, Louise decides to go apologize to him for losing it, but just as she tries to find him, she sees him leaving on a horse with Siesta, and immediately goes to ask Marteau where she might be going. Hours later, Saito and Siesta reach the outskirts of her village, but when she offers to introduce him to her parents, he asks if it's really a good idea since they might get the wrong idea. She then apologizes for trying to impose and runs off to find the location of the dragon, while he and Delfinger talk about how she is so much better than Louise. Several minutes later, Siesta returns with a map to the spot the dragon was hidden, but just as they try to leave, Augusta shows up and asks to join the treasure hunt. When Gitch says that it might be the only way to make up for how useless he was in Albion, Saito wonders what happened after Wales got murked. Meanwhile, Cromwell has just turned every civilian in the nation into his puppets so they can wage war against Tristane. Back in Siesta's village, the gang has just located a secret cave which should lead to the dragon, but after taking a couple steps inside, they hear footsteps and prepare for a fight. The next moment, they get attacked with lightning bolts, but Saito counters the attack before recognizing the voice and seeing Colbert with Louise. While he explains his expedition to also find the dragon, Saito and Louise continue their toxic arguments until Delfinger tells them that everyone has already left. Moments later, they all exit the cave and see what appears to be an abandoned hangar. But while Colbert works on breaking the lock, Saito notices a tombstone and gets shocked when he sees Japanese inscriptions written on it. As soon as Colbert opens the locks, they all go in, and Saito once again struggles to believe his eyes upon seeing that the supposed dragon is actually a fighter jet. Just as he explains that it's from his world, Colbert says there is a way for him to go back home because the only reason Siesta's grandfather got stranded was because he couldn't fly into the eclipse on time. Upon hearing this, Louise gets sad as she realizes that he will actually be leaving her soon. At the time, Henrietta has just told her mum about the letter Wards stole and apologizes for failing their country. But Marianne tells her to stop pretending like she isn't still sad over Wales's death. Henrietta then breaks down in her arms before a guard runs in to tell them about the war Cromwell is planning. By then, Osman and Colbert have just transported the fighter jet to the academy, so Saito jumps inside to figure out the controls and learns that his ability gives him instant mastery over any weapon. The next moment, he notices that Louise has been staring at him, and after she storms off to hide how bad she feels, Gooch rides in to tell her about the war. Hours later, Cromwell finalizes his plans with Wards and Longville and decides to launch a full-scale attack in 3 days because the eclipse happening that night will increase the power of the ring. Back in Tristane, Saito has just told Louise that he might be leaving forever on the night of the eclipse, but instead of telling him how she really feels, she acts like it makes no difference to her, so he storms out. By sundown, Delfinger notices that he is still upset about it and asks if she really means that much to him, but he denies it and tucks himself in for the night. Meanwhile, Osman has just gathered the entire academy to tell them about the war, since they would have to shut down until it ends, so most of the students start making plans plans to go back home. Geach then uses that as an opportunity to make himself look better by promising to stay back and fight, but Margarita tells him to stop acting like he ever had a choice in the matter. When Augusta asks Louise if she will also leave, she reminds her that she has never backed away from a fight and returns to the room to say goodbye to Saito. The next day, he finds a note beside him and struggles to understand the language, so he shows it to Delfinger, who then says that Louise has finally set him free. He immediately runs out to find her, and after showing the letter to Augusta, she remembers what Louise said the previous night and tells him that she probably went to see Henrietta. Hours later, he asks Delfinger if he has any plans for after the night of the eclipse, but Delfinger says he will probably just end up at another weapons store. Saito then starts to wonder if returning to a world run by gens is the right move and reminisces on everything he has experienced with Louise. The following day, Siesta joins the locals in her town for the usual workouts, but just as she realizes that she won't be able to see Saito off, Cromwell's ship enters their airspace as his army prepares to launch a full-scale attack. Hours later, Henrietta promises to save their nation even if it's the last thing she does, so her mom offers up some prayers of good luck before they start heading out. The following day, Augusta and Tabita go to see Saito off, but after bringing over several barrels of gasoline he managed to create, Colbert tells him about the war. Moments later, they finish loading up the jet, so Saito quickly starts it up and asks Tabita for help to get it into the air since they don't have enough space for a proper runway. However, as soon as he takes off, Tabita decides to join the fight, so Augusta cancels her vacation plan. Meanwhile, Henrietta has just led her army to the front lines and reminds them to stick to the battle plans, but it ends up being pointless as Cromwell's Dragon Knights easily take down Henrietta's Griffin Riders. The regular knights then try to charge in, but plasma cannons from the ship clear out an entire squad in seconds, leaving the others with no choice but to regroup. Just then, they see that the eclipse has just started, so Luis looks around for Saito and sees him entering their airspace with the jet. Instead of focusing on his escape, he starts shooting down all the Dragon Knights to help with the fight, so Wards and Longbill decide to join the battle as well. Just as Saito takes down the last Dragon Knight, Ward shows up on a new species known for its high speed and easily dodges the jet's guns before unleashing his own attacks. While Saito focuses on blocking, Longbill summons her golem to face Geach and the girls and promises to make sure they pay for putting her in jail. Geach immediately tries to run, but Tabita holds him back and asks if he remembers alchemy class with Miss Chevreuse. The next moment, he covers Longbill and her golem with rose petals, but she starts laughing until he turns it all into oil. After Augusta lights her up, the golem shatters and she tries to escape again, so Geach chases after her. Louise then catches up to them, but notices that Saito has started taking hits, so she joins the girls to help him out and waits until they attack the speed dragon before jumping towards the jet. With Tabita's help, she climbs into the cockpit with Saito and admits that she never wanted him to leave, but then Wards catches up to them again and resumes his attacks. When Saito promises to protect Louise no matter what happens, she finally accepts her feelings for him and awakens her true powers by absorbing some of his. She then stands to recite an incantation, and Saito focuses on evasive maneuvers until she unleashes a blinding blast that obliterates Wards and Cromwell's entire fleet in an instant. Moments later, he sees Augusta and Tabita and tries to gain control of their minds with the ring, but Geach knocks him out and apologizes for failing to catch Longbill. Meanwhile, Saito, who has just crashed the jet, waits for Luis to wake up before saying that he might be staying for a little longer. After calling him stupid for missing his shot, she kisses him but claims it was just to renew their master and slave contract. Days later, life returns to normal at the academy, and after hours of searching, Luis finds Saito chatting with Siesta and reminds him that she wears the pants in their relationship. In a dream several nights later, Saito finally returns to Japan and loses himself in excitement, as he never expected to escape life with Louise. But after thinking about everything they have been through already, he starts regretting it and ends up crashing the jet. The next moment, he wakes up on the floor of her room and rushes to hug her as he realizes it was all a dream. But she quickly reminds him why he wanted to leave by putting him in his place. To his greatest surprise, she stops herself from attacking and acknowledges the fact that he gave up life as a broke Gen Z NPC to be with her. After also promising to stop whooping him, she invites him back into bed, but he decides to sleep with one eye open just in case she decides to run insane later in the night. The following day, Henrietta tries to talk her way out of her coronation ceremony, but Cardinal Masterini explains that she needs to become the queen to renew the people's hope, especially after what happened in Albion. As the ceremony progresses, Cromwell gets excited for his prison meal, but almost pisses himself when he sees a familiar face through the peephole. He immediately explains the mysterious power Louise used to justify his weakness, but she makes up her mind and uses the Ring of Anvarid to conclude his sentence. Around the same time, Louise presents Saito with a special pair of glasses before saying they have to go watch the coronation. But on the way out moments later, he sees Siesta and rushes over to speak with her. At first, she decides to ignore the glasses, but when he starts drooling over her jugs, it suddenly lights up, so she asks if he plans to join a circus. As he starts struggling to take it off, Louise explains that it was specially designed to light up whenever the wearer starts losing his senses to another chick's plots. She then proceeds to light him up as punishment, but his lack of shame leads him to stare at every chick's cakes with evil intent. So Louise spends most of the day blowing him up until they finally get to Henrietta's coronation ceremony. As her carriage gets closer, Louise makes the mistake of letting Saito look, so he immediately feasts his eyes on her royal milk bags.
Nice.
Causing Louise to go off the rails again. However, her explosion attracts the attention of Henrietta's new top soldiers, so they arrest Saito, and Louise ends up at the palace later on, struggling with the guards to speak with Henrietta. When General Agnes finally steps in to calm her down and explains that Henrietta is in a meeting with Osman, Louise starts begging her for Saito's freedom instead. Meanwhile, our shameless Mk once again reminds himself that all this wouldn't be happening if he had just gone back to Japan. Just as he starts thinking about the kiss with Henrietta to drown his sorrows, she shows up to talk to him, but he gets startled and jumps back. She then grabs his hand to ask for a favor, and he immediately offers to do whatever she wants while pouting his lips for a sloppy kiss. The next moment, Aang shatters his face and almost sends him up to the Lord, but Henrietta holds her back before telling Saito about her meeting with Osman. Ever since what happened at Albion, Masarini and practically every other noble in the royal circle has insisted on taking over the nation. But Henrietta explains how dangerous another war could be and asks him for help. Naturally, he agrees to it, but she further emphasizes how important it is for her to have a few trusted allies because it was probably one of their high-ranked guards that left. The prison doors open for whoever murked Cromwell. To seal the deal, Henrietta offers to do whatever he wants in return, so he considers asking for some milk.
Yeah, boy.
But then Louise walks in, so he tries to explain himself. The next moment, she jumps on him and starts bawling her eyes out because of how worried she was, so he comforts her until they enter a carriage back to the academy. Once there, Agnes explains their code names and warns Saito to never look at Henrietta with unholy intentions before leaving. Right then, Louise switches back to being toxic and whips him until sunrise the next day, when Agnes returns to tell her that Henrietta was kidnapped. During the night, Henrietta decided to put on the sacred ring of water she wore on the night she swore an oath to love Wales forever. Seeing as he was also head over heels in love with her, he also swore to love her until the end of time. But remembering this caused her to get emotional, as she had still not come to terms with the fact that he was no longer alive. Right then, she heard his voice and immediately prepared herself for a fight, but he actually showed up outside her window and proved that it was really him by holding up his ring of wind. Without giving it a second thought, she rushed over to hug him and asked him to start living with her, but he refused and asked her to follow him back to Albion instead. When she tried to change his mind, he shut her up with a kiss and reminded her of their promise on the lake. Back in Louise's room, Agnes has just explained how they found her room empty in the morning and asks if they can join her elite squad for a covert mission to get her back, because her subjects might lose it if they figure out what happened. After they agree to it, Agnes tells them that her cadets have already tracked Henrietta towards Lake Lagdorian, and as soon as she heads out, Saito and Louise climb into the jet to take off. Colbert then tries to warn them that most of its parts are still missing, but Saito takes off regardless and soon regrets it when the jet starts breaking apart in the air. By then, Henrietta, who just had another dream of the time Wales hid behind a tree to see her royal cakes, wakes up in his arms. So he quickly works his magic to distract her from Agnes and her cadets as they slowly catch up. At one point, he starts firing wind magic to stop them, but Henrietta remains intoxicated by his god-level riz until he almost unilives them with a powerful spell. As his love spell starts to wear off, he levels up his sweet talk and easily convinces her to stick with him. Meanwhile, Louise has just started strangling Saito for making her enter a faulty jet when she was the one insisting on taking off as soon as possible. As they both plummet to a painful end, Augusta shows up with Tabita and saves them. So Saito manages to land the jet on the lake just as Wales and Henrietta get to the shore. After Augusta and Tabita also land, Saito takes a close look at him and asks if he was revived by the Ring of Anveri. So Wales thinks back to when Cromwell resurrected him, but still claims he is the real one. Upon hearing this, Tabita attacks him with ice spears, but the holes immediately close up, so Louise tells Henrietta to stop letting herself be blinded by love. However, even after Wales attacks the girls, Henrietta still insists that he is the same prince she fell in love with and says they just can't understand true love. Saito then decides to take matters into his own hand and charges up his powers to attack, but Henrietta creates a wall of ice to stop him. Wales then combines his powers with hers to create a powerful tornado, so Saito focuses every muscle to hold it back while Louise scrambles for a spell to counter it. As Saito starts losing strength, Delfinger reminds him that his sole purpose is to keep Louise safe, so he forces himself to press on until she figures out the spell and summons a lightning bolt that deep-fried Wales. Moments later, Henrietta tries to help him up, but he starts apologizing for trying to deceive her and tells her to fall in love with someone else because he won't be able to love her forever as they promised each other. After refusing, she keeps telling him to stay with her, but his injuries get worse, so he reminds her to move on before returning to his ancestors. Days later, all the chicks on campus gather outside to cry for their boyfriends because they got drafted for the war against Albion. Surprisingly, even Margarita loses control of her emotions and finally tells Gitch the magic words he has been waiting to hear. Saito, on the other hand, gets excited since he will basically be the only guy in school with all the sad, magnum-deprived hotties, but Luis quickly smacks the evil thoughts out of his mind. Just then, they all see a dragon approaching from the sky and watch in awe as a blondie with a lethal face card lands and walks straight to Luis to introduce himself. In class minutes later, all the girls continue drooling over Julio's perfect face and completely forget that their boyfriends might never come back from war. This causes Saito to get depressed, as he quickly realizes that his harem dreams will not be coming true. But then Aang suddenly walks in with her cadets and orders them out of the class. As soon as they all stand up, Colbert orders them to sit back down and tells Aang that he doesn't want them to bring anything about the war on school grounds, since the boys have already left. Aang then tells him that magical algebra won't help anyone in real life and holds her sword next to his throat as a warning for the next time he interferes with official business. After Aang tries to explain the importance of combat skills, Margarita decides to run her mouth about how they are only inclined to use magic. So Aang grabs her wand and twists her arm to demonstrate how weak and utterly useless they would all be when faced with real danger. Without so much as a peep, they all start training, so Saito decides to sit back and observe, since being a familiar frees him from any obligations to fight in the war. However, his initially peaceful watch gets fueled by envy when Julio turns down Augusta's chocolate jugs to ask Luis for a sparring match. To make matters worse, he uses that opportunity to start working his magic, but just as Saito considers beating him up, Aang's assistant Michelle attacks him to see if he is actually strong. Moments later, he ends up unconscious, so Luis rushes over and yells at Michelle for going too hard on him. Confused, she and Aang ask why he is suddenly so weak, so Luis explains that he can only activate his skill by using Delfinger or any real weapon. Aang then expresses disappointment, as she thought he was a real swordsman, but then Julio asks for a duel with him and says the winner gets to kiss Luis. Naturally, Saito gets flared up and accepts it, so Luis reminds him that his going all out might be dangerous for Julio, but Saito insists on fighting him, so she decides to make him use a fake sword. Hours later, Saito takes Aang aside to ask for a private lesson because he really is useless without his abilities, and after commending him on accepting his faults, she starts an intense training session to test his limits. Around the same time, Luis finds Siesta and accuses her of hiding Saito and her ginormous melons, but she swears that they haven't talked all day, so she goes to ask Augusta and Tabita instead. Seizing the opportunity, Augusta explains where to find him but spins the story to make it sound like he is having a freak-off with Aang. By then, Aang has covered his entire body in bruises, but he continues fighting and finally finds a way to exploit her hatred for fire mages. Just as he lands on top of her, Luis shows up and immediately blows them both up in a fit of rage. The next day, Julio feels pity as soon as he sees Saito's bruised up face, so he offers to let him rest, but Saito claims he is more than ready for the fight. So he asks Luis to prepare her lips just to instigate the already pissed off simp. While everyone watches, both guys unleash every combo they can think of to gain the upper hand, and soon enough, Julio starts overpowering our boy. However, after they both charge in for the final strike, Saito ends up winning, but instead of celebrating, he gets pissed while all the girls rush over to comfort Julio. When Luis asks if he is not interested in the kiss, he rejects it
Emotional damage.
and says Julio lost on purpose before storming out. As Luis follows behind him to ask if he really doesn't want the kiss, Michelle summons them both for a meeting, and as soon as they get to the office, Saito sees Julio and loses it. The next moment, Julio reveals that he was never interested in the duel because they are actually teammates, and as Saito tries to wrap his head around what he just said, Henrietta pulls down her hood and says they have to work together. She then thanks them both for saving her from zombie whales and explains that she needs all the help she can get for the war against Albion, but Saito remains salty over the fact that Julio is joining them. After the blonde playboy explains that the Pope of his country sent him to help with the war as well, Henrietta once again asks for their help, so Saito agrees to support her before arguing with Luis for falling for Julio's riz again. In Albion minutes later, a purple-haired baddie named Sheffield addresses the people and claims Henrietta unalived Cromwell to instigate their anger for the war. While she continues planting anger into their hearts, the members of her council wonder how she went from being Cromwell's secretary to the new leader of Albion. Days later, Saito turns over in bed and tries to grab Louise Milkers, but after scratching her flatboard chest for a couple minutes, he gives up. Just as she tries to attack him, her hot sister Eleanor rushes inside and tells her to pack up so they can go back home. In a matter of minutes, she drags them both out and decides to take Siesta along as well for the extra help. Later on, Saito ends up in a separate carriage with Siesta, and as he tries to strike up a conversation, Louise starts losing it. But then Eleanor grabs her face and almost tears it off while warning her to focus on their conversation. She goes on to explain how going through military training is not right for a young noble like her, and suggests starting her bridal training instead. Upon hearing this, Louise tries to complain, but Eleanor loses it and starts scolding her for trying to argue. Back in the other carriage, Saito has just noticed Siesta's cold expression, so he asks if everything is okay, and she responds by claiming to know his true feelings. The moment she asks why he chose Louise, a road bump causes them to hug each other, and Louise, who had been watching, immediately blows them both up. Hours later, they arrive at Louise's family mansion, and both Saito and Siesta watch in awe as the girls get welcomed by an army of maids. Saito then notices another hot sister named Catalia and loses his senses to the beauty of her milkers while she hugs Louise and expresses how happy she is to see her again. Upon noticing the worried look on her face, Catalia tells Louise not to worry about her before Eleanor says it's time for dinner with their mom. At the dinner table moments later, Louise tries to start a conversation with her mom, but Eleanor quickly takes over and says she should drop out of the academy to focus on getting married. When Louise tells her to focus on her relationship with a certain count, Catalia tries to explain that her relationship already failed, but Eleanor loses it and prepares to skin her alive for even bringing it up. Thankfully, their mother manages to calm her down and decides to leave anything related to Louise's love life until their dad returns tomorrow. Later that night, Saito struggles to fall asleep as he considers the possibility of Louise actually getting married. Meanwhile, Siesta also struggles to fall asleep as she thinks of a way to win him back from Louise. And after checking herself out in the mirror and remembering her two massive assets, she decides to put her God-given talents to good use. Around the same time, Catalia prepares Louise for bed, and when she starts complaining about how Eleanor hates her, Catalia explains that she just has a toxic way of expressing herself. Moments later, they both get into bed. So Catalia changes the topic to Louise's love life again and starts by asking if she has feelings for Saito. Naturally, Louise denies having any sort of attachment to him, but after a couple more seconds of straight cap, her completely red face gives Catalia all the answers she needs. Louise then tries to hide under the blanket, but Catalia pulls it off and tells her to follow her heart. So she leaves the room to find Saito but continues deluding herself into thinking she doesn't really like him. Once at his room, she slowly opens the door and climbs into his blanket before pulling him close for a kiss. However, while trying to hold his chest, she notices an unusual amount of meat in the area and finally realizes that she has been smooching Siesta, who also jumps up in surprise and says she thought it was Saito. Louise completely loses it and starts demanding to know why she is in his room in the first place. So Siesta claims that he was the one who called her inside. Meanwhile, our poor unsuspecting M tries to find Louise's room in the hallway and ends up in Eleanor's room by mistake. After walking over to the side of the bed, he tries to ask about the marriage they were talking about earlier, but Eleanor, who is still half asleep, mistakes him for the count that dumped her and wraps her arms around him while asking for the D as usual. Saito prepares himself without hesitation, but just as he notices that her jugs feel different from the ones he is used to, she finally wakes up and almost experiences a heart attack. Saito then tries to explain himself, but she quickly grabs 2 whips to teach him never to repeat such a foolish mistake. While she continues beating him up, Louise returns to Catlia's room and spends the night crying in her arms. At the breakfast table the following day, their dad finally returns from his meeting, and after saying that he has to leave for another one, he complains about how Henrietta is putting the citizens in unnecessary danger with this war. Louise then tries to defend her, but the mustache ambassador tells her to focus on things like marriage because a talent-lacking wannabe has no business discussing magical politics. The moment he leaves, Eleanor brings up her marriage again, so Louise once again asks why she is not getting married first. After Eleanor attacks her again, Catlia tells them both to stop putting her on the spot so soon, so their mom asks Louise if she already has feelings for someone. She immediately denies it, but once again, her face turns to the same color as a baboon's backside, so they start asking who the unlucky guy is until she gets fed up and runs away. Catlia then decides to have a chat with Saito, and after letting him feast his eyes on her beauty for a few minutes, she assures him that Louise will grow to be even more attractive. After explaining where to find her and also saying that she has prepared a carriage so he can carry her away from all the family drama, she offers her blessings and tells him to keep her happy. Shortly after this, Louise starts sobbing on a boat as she convinces herself that he only has eyes for Siesta, and when he shows up to take her away, she refuses and complains about the fact that no one in the family gives her credit. He then climbs into the boat with her and showers her with praises, but she refuses to accept it and says he probably uses the same lines on Siesta. This causes him to lose it, so he asks if any guy in their right mind would give up a chance to go home for a plotless princess if they truly didn't care about them. This causes Louise to rethink her opinion of him, but she still acts like his words mean nothing until he confesses to loving her. After he explains just how much he loves her, she starts fidgeting like a wet android and offers to let him touch anything he wants. So he pulls her in close for a kiss. As he pushes her back onto the boat, she tries to resist, but he shuts her up with even more kisses until she gives in and continues making out with him.
Yeah, boy.
Moments later, they get to shore, but she gets shocked to see her entire family staring down at them and tosses him out of the boat. Her dad then sends a squad of covered knights to destroy Saito, but he quickly pulls out Delfinger to activate his powers and rushes past them before grabbing Louise, who is still delirious from the kiss. After telling her dad not to worry about her, he tries to escape, but he immediately starts blasting and sends a golem to lift up the bridge. Thankfully, Catlia breaks the chains apart, so he climbs over the golem and sees Siesta waiting at the carriage to carry them back to the academy. Minutes later, Louise makes it back from La La Land, and asks where he was last night since he claimed to not have called Siesta to his room. So he explains what went down with Eleanor. As usual, she refuses to believe him and attacks, while Siesta deludes herself into thinking she is the only one with the key to his happiness. At the academy a couple days later, the girls resume combat training as usual, but Agnes interrupts their routine to say that they will now start working with their abilities instead of regular weapons. To help with that, she introduces none other than Eleanor, who turns out to be some sort of expert from the National Magic Academy. In Louise's room afterwards, Eleanor explains that she was actually sent to them because Henrietta specifically requested it, and after saying that she somehow learned of her plan to lock Louise up in the family mansion for marriage, she tries to tear her face off. Louise then promises that she had nothing to do with it, so Eleanor decides to focus on the fact that she can now protect her from Saito's peasant lips. The next moment, Louise sees two pets and gets excited because they belong to Cat Leah, who then walks in and says she was appointed as Eleanor's assistant. Later that night, Siesta catches Saito going through Eleanor's plot armor, and after he quickly explains that she ordered him to arrange them, Siesta offers to help. After grabbing one of the royal kitty covers, she asks if they would look good on her, so Saito jokingly tells her to try it on if she really likes it. She then starts talking about how she will finally be on equal footing with Louise, but as she lifts her dress to put it on, Louise walks in and imagines the worst. However, as she prepares to attack him, a sudden explosion rocks the academy. So Saito rushes out to figure out what happened and ends up outside Osmond's office with every other student in the vicinity. When they all start asking what happened, Osmond tells them not to worry about it, and Agnes orders everyone back to their rooms. So Louise tells Saito to prepare for a beating, but then Agnes requests specifically for him and claims it's part of their secret mission. Inside the office moments later, Osman explains how a mage thief broke in and stuffed the wind and water ruby rings down her milkers as soon as she saw him. After he left the stamp on her massive jugs, she escaped, but since no one has stepped foot outside the academy in the last few hours, they agree that it had to be an insider. Osman also reveals that the rings she stole were actually copies of the original, which are both still safe with a good friend of his. Upon hearing this, Michelle starts asking a bunch of questions about how trusted this friend is, but Agnes decides to focus on finding out who the thief is. For starters, they tell Saito not to tell Louise because the thief was a mage, which makes her a suspect along with her sisters. Naturally, Saito refuses to accept that they would steal, so Agnes tasks him and Julio with finding the culprit, and explains that they should be able to know the truth by looking for Osman's stamp on every pair of jugs in the academy. Minutes later, Saito starts heading towards Eleanor's room with Michelle, so he asks if she has a plan, and she immediately shuts down any hope he had of working with her by saying she would never partner up with a weakling. Saito then sneaks into Eleanor's room on his own and manages to uncover her plot cannons, but after he sees that she is definitely too small to be the culprit, she wakes up and startles him before whipping some sense into his depraved mind. Shortly after this, he decides to ignore the pain and sneaks into Catleya's room, but her animals get excited and wake her up right before Louise walks in and scolds him for failing to return to the room at night. She then drags him out and says she will never believe a word he says because he has been simping after every baddie he finds, despite claiming to be in love with her. Once at her room, she pulls out a special new whip to make sure he regrets his actions, but he gets saved by another explosion. This time, Catleya ends up being the target, so they all head over to her room to make sure she was not harmed. Just then, Agnes rushes inside to take a look at her jugs, and after seeing a bruise on the spot where the stamp should be, she asks one of the girls to use healing magic on her. She then tells Agnes to get rid of all the spectators before asking Catleya for the details of the attack. Catleya then explains how the thief blasted into the room and attacked her with a melted candle stand, which is how she ended up with the bruise on her jugs. But Julio struggles to believe this and says she might be cooking up the story to protect herself, since she also uses earth magic. This accusation catches Louise off guard, so she asks what is going on, and Agnes basically explains how they are all suspects. After learning about the investigation, she turns to Saito and demands to know why he didn't tell her anything about it, but he avoids the question and asks Julio how he already checked every other chick on campus. Julio then explains the perks of looking like he was sculpted in the heavens to make Saito jealous, and right after this, Michelle shows Agnes the rings and claims she just saw them in a hidden compartment in the room. Agnes then asks Catleya to own up to her actions, but she insists on having no idea how it got there, and Louise immediately supports her. As she tries to argue about it, Eleanor walks in and tells her to relax before picking up the candle stand and finding a strand of hair in it. Using a special potion she got from a friend, she sends the hair back to its owner, and they all freeze in shock when it returns to Michelle, who then denies having anything to do with it. She further accuses Eleanor of trying to set her up and asks Agnes to arrest her, but Agnes tells her to open up her melons first just to rule out any possibilities. Upon hearing this, Michelle tries to play the victim card and acts like she is being betrayed, but Agnes explains that Osmond actually lied about the rings being a copy just so that the culprit would be moved to frame someone. So she rips open her shirt and reveals the stamp just to distract Agnes for long enough to pull her sword. Thankfully, Saito blocks it and manages to tackle her sword away, but she quickly uses her abilities to blow up the windows and escape. Just as she jumps out, Katlia summons a golem to stop her, and after Agnes destroys her wand, Eleanor invites Katlia and Louise to spend the night in her room. In an interrogation room minutes later, Michelle claims that she is the one who got betrayed by the nation because several years ago, her dad was framed for corruption and stripped of his title, which caused him to unalive himself. After her mom did the same, she was left to wander the country all alone. But then Agnes reveals that she was also the sole survivor of a fire that burned down her entire village and tells Michelle that it does not justify her betrayal. She then demands to know who she was working for, and when Michelle decides to only say that he is the one person that looked out for her, Agnes names the president of legal affairs and says he was actually the one behind the corruption scandal that made her an orphan. Upon hearing this, Michelle loses it and says there is no way Leishman could betray her, so Agnes further explains the amount of research she has done on him, while Louise prepares to punish Saito for going behind her back. The following day, Agnes heads over to the palace to report the case to Henrietta, and after letting her go through all the details, she asks if it's time to arrest Leishman. Henrietta then says they need more concrete evidence of his misdeeds because no one will believe Michelle. When she suggests sticking with a certain plan they have been cooking up, Agnes tells her to reconsider because of how dangerous it could be, but Henrietta claims it won't be a problem because she will get a special bodyguard for protection. Later on, Saito and Louise end up in front of Scarin's shop, but he gets cold feet upon seeing the door and tries to escape the mission, so Louise drags him inside. As soon as they walk through the doors, Scarin welcomes them with a zesty performance that traumatizes them both. So Jessica rushes over to help and asks why they suddenly showed up. After explaining that it is a special mission from Henrietta, they ask why Scarin is so hyped up, so Jessica tells them all about the Royal Theater he will be performing in tonight. Before they can ask for more details, Scarin forces Saito to go help with the dishes, while Louise immediately gets forced into a costume for the performance. Hours later, Saito tries to take in the beauty of being around so many milkers, but Louise shows up to spoil his fun and tries to rip his legs off until Scarin calls her out to serve a special customer, who ends up being none other than Julio, Leak always. He quickly starts working his magic on her, but explains that he is actually here on Aang's orders, so Louise reluctantly plays along while Saito boils over with jealousy. Shortly after this, Saito heads out to drop some crates, but then a hooded lady bumps into him, so he tries to help her up and gets shocked to see that it's actually Henrietta. She then shuts him up because of the army of knights searching for her and takes him inside before asking if he can be her bodyguard for the next few hours. When he asks why she can't use her power as the new queen to request any bodyguard she wants, she explains that it's all part of her undercover mission, so he agrees to it but says she can't do anything dangerous because Louise would unalive him for failing to keep her safe. The next moment, Henrietta asks for peasant clothes to avoid unwanted attention, so Saito takes a quick look around and finds the shirt Louise wore earlier. As he then turns to give it to her, he sees her royal jugs and immediately covers his eyes for mental protection before handing over the shirt. Minutes later, Scarin decides to close up the shop so they can make it to the theater in time for the performance. So Louise finally realizes that Saito is missing. By then, he and Henrietta have just gotten to a checkpoint and realize that the knights are checking everyone to find her, so she suggests acting like a couple and places his arm around her shoulders. As they get close to the knights, Saito's poor acting skill nearly gives it away, so Henrietta places his hand in between her jugs to make it look like they are about to smash. While they make their way to a hotel, Aang had just arrived at Leishman's place and waits for him to come out before breaking the news of Henrietta's kidnapping. Upon hearing this, he loses it and asks why her unit is so incompetent, so she promises to get Henrietta and asks for his signature on an order for the closure of every major road. After getting the signature, she prepares to lead but suddenly stops to ask about the mission from 20 years ago, where he approved the total destruction of a small village on the outskirts of the kingdom. When he claims to barely remember it and says the village was planning to attack the capital, she asks if he at least knows who the captain of the mission was. He then tells her to focus on finding Henrietta instead of asking unimportant questions, so she thanks him for the signature and heads out. By then, Saito and Henrietta have just found a room to settle in, but she suddenly starts complaining of the cold and asks him to hold her shoulder. As soon as he leans in to keep her warm, a bunch of soldiers start threatening to knock down the door, so she quickly pushes him back into the bed for a steamy makeout session right before the soldiers enter. Back at Leishman's mansion, he sends a suspicious goon to deliver a message, so Agnes tails him back to town and keeps following until Louise sees her and asks what is going on. Left with no other choice, she drags Louise into a local inn to keep watching the goon as he walks up to her room to tell a spy about Henrietta's kidnapping. Louise, who has no idea what is happening, panics at the thought of Henrietta getting kidnapped and startles the goon, so Aang quickly locks lips with her to avoid any suspicion. She then rushes outside to follow the goon and explains the plan to Louise, while Henrietta does the same with Saito and says he is the only one she could trust with her safety. Several minutes later, they all arrive at the theater, so Louise quickly tracks Saito down, but Scarin also sees them and forces them to join the performance. However, just a couple minutes into it, Leishman concludes the plan to overthrow Henrietta with a spy from Albion, so she finally reveals herself and places him under arrest for treason. The next moment, he sends his army against her and runs off. So Giulio focuses on stopping the spy while Saito protects Henrietta from Leishman's attack. To avoid getting captured, he uses a trapdoor on stage to drop down to a secret passage, but Aang shows up to stop him and says it's finally time for him to pay for burning down her village and entire family. After lying about where she can find a report of the mission to distract her, he unleashes a powerful flame spell to finish her off, but she runs right through it and stabs him in the chest. Later, Luis finally gets some alone time with Saito and starts demanding to know what he was doing with Henrietta. So he quickly changes the topic and also asks what she was doing as well without him. This causes her to remember the embarrassing kiss from Aang's, so she switches to gaslighting and yells at him while everyone else watches. Days later, Marcini presents Henrietta with a declaration of war order for her signature, and when she hesitates to accept it, he explains that every member of the cabinet has already agreed to it. After a general walks in to ask for her signature as well, she asks why they all want bloodshed. So Marcini explains that not accepting the war will only cause the citizens to revolt against her, as they all also want to see Albion conquered. He goes on to say that she is at risk of a coup if she refuses, but she still insists that aiming for peace is the right thing to do. This causes the general to get upset, but Marcini holds him back and acknowledges Henrietta's hatred for unnecessary bloodshed. He then tells her that signing the declaration is also the best move for the people because if a coup rises and dethrones her, the subsequent leader is likely going to be a cold-hearted tyrant who would not care how many lives have to be sacrificed for victory. After listening to all this, Henrietta accepts that he is right and signs the declaration, officially starting the war against Albion. A week later, Louise takes Saito into town to read the news on their army's current status in the war. While she gets excited to see that they have already won the first battle, Saito gets distracted and starts walking off. So she asks if he doesn't care about the war. He then asks why Henrietta signed the declaration after all her talk about peace. So Louise reminds him that she has a responsibility to the people that won't always feel good. Just then, Saito spots a sailor uniform at a kiosk and excitedly rushes over to buy it before talking to himself about how Luis's plotless physique would only ruin the look. Much later, Giulio finds Aang's in a bad mood, so he asks about it before calling Saito and Luis to her office for a chat. Aang's then tells them about a report on the massacre of her village that was apparently stored in a building right under the academy. She had already gotten permission from Henrietta to access it, but Osman refused to undo the magical locks on it, which is why she has been pissed all day long. Giulio then asks Saito and Luis to help get inside the building since they have all become close friends, but the thought of being besties with the cheesy playboy sends literal chills down Saito's spine. When he turns to Luis and asks if she can use her void magic to unlock the doors, Saito tells him to stop overestimating her because she can only blow things up. The next moment, Louise decides to test out her explosive magic on them and destroys the entire office before they go and ask Eleanor for help. Around the same time, Siesta, who has just put on the sailor uniform for Saito, gets excited to show it to him, but then she sees them all heading into the ladies' room and decides to stalk them. Moments later, Aang's opens the trap door leading into the underground tunnel, and as soon as they reach the main entrance, Eleanor takes over and quickly breaks into all 3 locks with her magic. Aang's then decides to go in by herself, but Eleanor immediately tells her to forget about it because she wants to learn about all the illegal magical experiments the nation has conducted. After Saito and the others also agree to go with her, Colbert shows up and reminds Aang's that Osman was against this, but she refuses to listen to his low testosterone rant and storms inside. While walking through the tunnel moments later, she further explains how important it is to uncover every secret because she will have to protect Henrietta once she joins the war at the front lines. Upon hearing this, they all get worried, but Aang suddenly tells them to stop moving because someone has been following them. They then prepare to fight whoever it is until Siesta rushes towards Saito with her jugs swinging in every direction. After explaining how Saito told her to put it on because Luis was too flat to make it work, she realizes her mistake, but it is already too late as Luis lets off another explosion that closes off their exit with debris. Siesta quickly pulls Saito out from all the rubble, and after Eleanor scolds Luis for not knowing where to use her magic, Aang tells them to focus on the mission since they are all already locked in. Moments later, Saito tries to focus on Siesta's beauty, but Giulio calls him back to reality to ask about the place he came from. When Colbert also says he would like to see it, Saito asks if he also got intrigued by the uniform, but he explains how peaceful Japan sounds and says he really hates it when young people fight in a war. Aang then tells him to stop being so soft, since he has a responsibility to teach his students how cruel the world can be. But Colbert doubles down and says she has no idea how painful a war can actually be for those involved. Upon hearing this, Saito asks if he has fought in a war, and after he says no, Aang tells them about the night her village got burned down and how she was only saved because a stranger carried her out. After saying that she has to know everyone connected to the massacre, they spot the storage building and rush over before ending up at the bridge used to reach it. Upon seeing the endless pit under it, Siesta throws herself on Saito, so Luis charges up for another explosion, but Eleanor stops her from unaliving the entire group. After promising to punish him later on, they join the others at the entrance and notice a warning against the use of magic before heading inside. As Aang quickly starts searching for the report, Saito notices the amount of attention Colbert has been giving her, so he asks if she looks like the type of chick he is into. While Colbert denies this and tries to explain his genuine concern for her, Siesta drops a bunch of books no one asked her to carry, so Eleanor scolds her before using magic to stack them back on the shelves. Just as Louise tries to remind her of the rule against using magic, the entire building goes haywire and tries to close the nen, so they start running out. However, Aang, who had just found the report, refuses to leave, so Colbert and Saito stay back to convince her. After refusing to leave, she notices that the name of the captain responsible has been torn out, so she tries to look for more clues, but one of the shelves drops and the books sprain her ankle. Moments later, Colbert and Saito carry her out, but upon seeing that the bridge is about to collapse, she tells them to go without her. Colbert then tells her to shut up for once and carries her onto his back before running across the bridge with Saito. After managing to safely get to the other side, they start heading to the exit, and Aang thanks Colbert for actually having balls before telling them that the report said her village was actually burned down to supposedly stop the spread of an epidemic. However, the fact that someone deliberately tore out the name of the captain responsible still causes Aang to feel suspicious, but they get reminded of a more important problem when they get to the spot where Louise blew up the walls. To salvage the situation, Julia tells Saito to have some fun with Siesta, since they might not be getting out anytime soon, and naturally, Louise gets mad enough to blow up the landslide she created. On the night Aang's village got burned down, a human version of Scar named Melville was the most excited of the bunch, as he was known for being a psychotic pyromaniac. Somewhere in Albion a couple nights later, Sheffield calls him to her office to ask for the services he is best known for, so he asks for the person she needs destroyed, as she starts explaining how Henrietta's troops seized their ports. He tells her to get straight to the point so he can figure out how many men it would take to reclaim the port, but she decides to target the Magic Academy instead. At the academy that same night, Eleanor suddenly shows up in Louise's room and kidnaps her with a blanket and rope while Saito sleeps. Her confused screams cause him to wake up, but instead of helping, he follows Eleanor to the holding cell where she finally releases Louise and says she will be spending some time isolated from everyone else because of what she said during the day. Hours before this, Aang was conducting the usual training routine for all the girls in the academy, and upon seeing how good they had become at fighting, Louise couldn't help but feel motivated. Aang then called for a break and told them that she would be leaving in 7 days to join Henrietta at the front lines, and Louise casually decided to also join the war so she could keep Henrietta safe. Back in the holding cell, Eleanor explains that it was actually Saito who snitched, so she tries to attack him, but Eleanor holds her back and says it would be pointless for her to join a war, especially because she has absolutely no control over her magic. After also seizing her wand, she heads out but tells Saito to keep an eye on her. When Louise once again asks for her freedom and says she can easily fight in the war, Colbert shows up and immediately tells her to forget about it, so Eleanor asks him to teach her a thing or two before leaving. He then tells Louise to stop thinking a war is similar to the princess tea parties she had growing up and flashes back to the night a village was burned down, before saying that there is nothing noble about a war because it's just a bunch of people unaliving each other. Later that night, Melville and his men enter the airspace above the academy, and after expressing how happy they are to be attacking a school packed with hotties, they take out the girl power cadets stationed at the entrance without breaking a sweat. As they continue the invasion, Tabitha rushes over to Augusta's room to tell her that something feels off. Meanwhile, Aang, who already noticed them, patiently waits with her sword until a dingus with a mohawk barges in and gets cut down in an instant. Her cadets immediately rush over to check on her, and after getting a full rundown of the situation, she starts giving out orders to save the students. Around the same time, Saito wakes up and sees Colbert trying to listen to all the commotion, so he asks if everything is okay, but Colbert tells him to focus on protecting Louise before running off. Minutes later, Melville and his men start moving everyone to the cafeteria, so Aang tries to figure out a new plan while Saito keeps telling Louise that it's nothing to worry about. Shortly after this, Fulio, who also got captured, tries to instigate Melville by dissing his entire squad and calling them weaklings who couldn't handle the front lines, but Osmond tells him to stop running his mouth. Melville then says he actually doesn't care about anything as long as his employer pays well, but he also makes it clear that his men won't hesitate to send them up to heaven if they cause trouble. The next moment, Margarita starts bawling her eyes out and refuses to shut up, so Melville walks over to her and asks if she has ever been roasted like a Thanksgiving turkey while still being conscious. After she immediately turns off her vocal cords, Osmond offers to let them keep him as a hostage in exchange for everyone else going free, but Melville tells him not to bother because no one would be interested in a washed-up old geezer like him. Eleanor and Catalia then offer themselves up as well, but he still refuses and says he would rather keep a whole school of rich chicks captive to gain leverage on Henrietta. By then, Aang's cadets had just finished setting up explosives by the windows, so she calls out to Melville from the door and demands that he release everyone or face the wrath of her girl squad. She then tries to distract him by asking why they would attack some regular academy, but Melville notices the explosives and blows them up with her cadets still stationed at the windows. Upon hearing this, Colbert sends a messenger owl out to get reinforcements, while Saito decides to give Louise her wand back. She then tries to figure out the unlock spell Eleanor used the other day, but eventually uses her favorite trick to blast the door right off its hinges. Back at the cafeteria, Melville decides to get a little more serious by unaliting Julio first, but Aang and her girls rush in to stop them. After he melts their guns, she pulls out her sword and charges in while calling him a coward. So he explains how he usually likes to burn his captive down to ashes. When he mentions the village he burned down with excitement 20 years ago, she realizes that he is the reason for her lifelong trauma and completely loses it. Meanwhile, Saito and Luis had just met up with Tabitha and Augusta, so they decide to go save everyone. But Colbert stops them and suggests waiting for reinforcements instead. After hearing him out, Augusta tells him to stay back in his office if he is so scared, because she has been itching for a real fight for ages. Back inside, Melville has just melted Aang's sword and forced her down. But when she asks if he was the captain that led the mission to burn her village, he stops to explain how the captain, who was called Flame Snake at the time, inflicted the scar on his face. While he goes on to rage about how he desperately wants to get his lick back, Aang freezes in terror as she realizes that there is someone even more brutal than him. Minutes later, Augusta tries to come up with a surprise attack to catch Melville off guard, and when Colbert reminds her that he is a professional mercenary with decades of experience, she ignores him to figure something out with the girls. However, after Luis agrees that they need someone to act as a detour and draw their attention, Colbert tells them to stay put so he can save everyone and asks Saito for help before heading to his office. Meanwhile, Melville continues gushing over how powerful this captain was that night and how he couldn't resist the urge to test his strength. That ended up being a brutal mistake, because after he attacked, his captain countered with a powerful blast that almost melted off his entire face. As he continues the story, Saito gets curious about the paper balloons being filled with a dark powder, so he asks Colbert how he plans to use it. But Colbert avoids the question and asks if everyone in his world is really equal. After Saito says yes and completely ignores the fact that guys like Mr. Beast can buy an entire country, Colbert expresses his wish to visit it once again before telling him to grab the stuff. By then, Augusta has just started losing her patience, so Tabitha convinces her to wait a little longer. Meanwhile, Melville has just finished giving Aang the history lesson, so he walks over to Osmond and demands that he make Henrietta pull her troops away from Albion. Osmond then claims that he cannot make such a demand from the Queen, so Melville asks if he would rather watch the students burn. Back outside, Augusta gets fed up and decides to make a move, but Colbert finally returns with Saito and says they all need to work together. While he explains the plan, Osmond tries to stop Julio from running his mouth, but he ignores this and calls Melville stupid for thinking Henrietta would bend to his wishes without putting up a fight. Upon hearing this, Melville decides to start by sending him up to the Lord, but as he raises his staff, the entire cafeteria gets flooded with Colbert's paper balloons as Tabitha uses her flight magic to lift them out of the crates while Augusta waits for the signal. Colbert then reminds Saito and Louise that the main priority is getting everyone out, before giving Augusta the signal to blow up the balloons. In an instant, Melville's goons get hit with an endless stream of flashbangs that stop them from seeing anything, and Tabitha proceeds to make this even worse by keeping the flames alive with her wind magic. However, instead of focusing on rescuing everyone like Colbert said, Saito and the girls start fighting the goons. But after he hands Aang a new sword to help out, Augusta and Tabitha get hit with a blast that throws them both across the hall. This confuses Augusta as she didn't think he would be able to see so soon, so he pulls out his eyeball and explains that he actually uses heat signature like a snake to track his victims. He then proceeds to pull her up by the head and explains how fun it would be to see her in flames before tossing her back to the floor. The next moment, he lets off a powerful blast to roast her alive, but an even stronger blue flame blocks his attack. Upon realizing that it was Colbert, they all freeze in shock, but Melville gets extremely excited and says he has been searching for him all these years. He goes on to explain how cold-hearted Colbert was in his prime, but they all still struggle to accept this until he easily knocks out one of the goons with a low-effort blast. After telling Augusta to take Tabitha outside where it's safe, Colbert instructs Luis and Saito to free the others as well, and they quickly accept his order without the usual backtalk, as they finally realize that their nerdy four-eye professor had always been an oge. As soon as Melville starts attacking him, Aang flashes back to the traumatic night her village was burned down and also charges in to attack him, but Colbert manages to avoid her sword and warns her to stay back from the flames, but she refuses. Melville then tries to roast her for interrupting their duel, but Colbert protects her again and continues pleading with her to leave. Seeing this as the perfect opportunity, Melville waits until she charges in again before firing off a powerful blast in her direction. Upon seeing the terrifying fireball heading her way, she freezes in fear, so Colbert shoves her out of the way and ends up in excruciating pain as he gets burned alive. Thankfully, his ability to control flames helps him keep the damage to a minimum, but it still stops him from getting back on his feet. Right then, Aang notices a scar on his back and experiences another wave of shock as she recalls that the man who saved her had a similar scar. While she gets confused about her next course of action, Colbert starts hitting Melville with every spell in his arsenal. But Melville takes it like a nice sauna session and brags about how strong he is compared to that knight in the village. That is, until Colbert pulls himself back up and unleashes a high-level spell unlike anything the blind psycho has ever experienced. After he gets back up and prepares to counter with his most powerful spell, Colbert gives up. So Aang rushes in and stabs Melville through the heart right before he completes the spell. Upon seeing this, Colbert drops and expresses how happy he is to see that she is safe, but she immediately asks why he saved her on that night. The next moment, Saito and the girls rush back inside to help him, so she orders them to stand back and raises her sword to stab him as well. As they all start begging her to reconsider, Colbert tells Augusta to move aside because he actually deserves to be unlaid by her sword. Just like Melville said earlier, he had actually burned down her entire village with a single spell. But after learning that it was not actually an abandoned epidemic site like Leishman and the others told them, he rushed inside to find any survivors and could only save her. He then tells Aang to make it quick, but asks that she stop taking lives after his own because no good comes from fighting in a war. Despite this, Aang gets pissed off again and still decides to stab him, but then Louise suddenly tells her to drop the sword and starts crying because he already kicked the bucket. The next morning, Aang finds Saito in the workshop and hands him a letter Colbert left behind, but since he can't read their language, Louise takes the letter and reads out Colbert's final wish to see his world at least once. After she leaves, Louise tries to talk to him about it, but notices that he is fighting back the tears, so she hugs him until he lets go and cries in her arms. Days later, they both arrive in Albion to see Henrietta because she summoned Louise for a special request. After they greet each other, the general asks Louise to aid the war with her abilities before pulling out a map to show her where the enemy camp they have to destroy is located. At first, Louise gets conflicted about it, but after Henrietta explains that it could be the only way to ensure that there are little to no civilian victims, she promises to give it her best shot. A couple hours after this, Saito pilots the jet through a snowstorm and continues running his mouth about not wanting to fight in a war until she tells him to shut his stupid mouth up and focus on flying. As soon as they spot the enemy camp, he opens up the hatch so she can start the incantation. But just as she summons enough magic for the blast, she loses consciousness and falls into his arms, so he takes the jet back up into the sky. After Delfinger says she can't use such a powerful spell so casually, she wakes up and immediately tells Saito to fly back to the enemy camp. As he then tries to warn her, she starts scolding him as usual until he tells her to move her kitty out of his face so he can see the Albion soldiers trying to attack them. After managing to evade them, Saito shoots down both of their dragons to avoid unaliving the soldiers, but the jet's engine also takes a hit that sends them crashing into the mountainside. Shortly after this, Henrietta receives word of their failure from the general, who then suggests launching a full-scale attack like they had originally planned. Left with no other option, Henrietta agrees to it but remains concerned about what might have happened to Saito and Louise. Much later, Saito carries Louise on his back to find shelter from the snow, and when she asks how they can ever face Henrietta again, he reminds her that the plan failed because she still has no control over her magic. She then spends the next few minutes pounding his skull before they find a small cave to use as shelter. Upon seeing the snot leaking from his nose, Louise gets creeped out and hands him a napkin to blow it out, but he asks for cuddles instead because he can't handle the cold. She immediately turns him down out of embarrassment, so he explains just how bad he feels until she leans into him to share some body heat. Instead of accepting this, Saito decides to test his luck by suggesting that they both strip to share more heat and is immediately sent flying into the snow, but this causes him to pass out. As she frantically tries to wake him up, Delfinger tells her not to bother because he at least got to be with the one he loves before heading to the afterlife. Hearing this causes Louise to panic, so she starts taking off her clothes and spends the rest of the night keeping him warm. The following day, she decides to avoid the subject since he clearly doesn't remember anything that happened, but Delfinger decides to jog his memory, so she stuffs him into the snow and threatens to break him the next time he tries to snitch. Shortly after this, Sheffield gives new orders to one of her generals regarding the base camp Henrietta plans to conquer, and as soon as he leaves, another cadet rushes in to tell her about Saito's jet. Around the same time, he and Louise had just stumbled upon one of the dragons from yesterday, so he prepares to attack, only to get jumped by a soldier named Henry. Thankfully, a leg injury he sustained from the fight causes him to pass out, so Louise tells Saito to carry him because she wouldn't be able to forgive herself for letting a wounded soldier meet his end in the cold. However, just a couple minutes after this, Henry wakes up and immediately attacks Saito again, so Louise tosses Delfinger over to him, but Saito once again hesitates to clap him and explains that he doesn't want anything to do with the war. Louise then asks Henry if he dropped his locket, and as he tries to snatch it back from her, she pulls it away and asks if no one taught him to express gratitude. Thankfully, Saito grabs it from her and returns it before carrying him once again to find a way off the mountain. When Louise brings up her pathetic failure again and wonders how she can explain it to Henrietta, Saito tells her to stop thinking so much and simply tell her what happened, but she continues yapping about how ashamed she is. Saito then tells her her about a ritual where failed soldiers from the past would spill their guts as an apology for failing at their mission. But she takes it a little too seriously and asks if he actually wants her dead. Frustrated, he reminds her that Henrietta has an entire army to lead, which means her not-so-surprising failure won't really make a difference to anybody. All of a sudden, she lashes out and says that being an honorable aristocrat willing to serve until the very end is the only way of life she can be proud of. Upon hearing this, Henry admits that he always thought aristocrats like her were a bunch of weaklings, and after commending her bravery, he finally introduces himself to get on a first-name basis. Minutes later, reinforcements arrive and start searching for the jet while Saito apologizes to Henry for unlighting his dragon. When he asks why they feel bad since it's all part of war, Saito reminds him that all he cares about is protecting Luis and the people he actually cares about. Luis then says that being a peasant stops him from understanding the value of honor, but then Henry admits that he would have loved the idea of fighting for the one he loves. Upon hearing this, Luis asks if the girl in his locket is special to him, so he explains how he had to break up with her because of the war. When Saito suddenly calls him stupid for doing that, Henry loses it and pushes him away before starting a fight. Saito then resists the urge to shatter his teeth and explains that he can still fight for the one he loves by making sure he returns to her after the war. Luis also agrees that being a soldier doesn't stop him from experiencing love, so he decides to stop fighting. But then they hear gunshots and realize that his comrades are closing in. The next moment, Henry rushes out to distract them, so Saito and Luis immediately make a run for it, only to get their cover blown by Giulio and his dragon. Luckily, they manage to climb on and make it out before Henry's comrades get close enough for a proper attack. Shortly after this, they return to Henrietta, and after receiving a hug, Louise drops to her knees and asks for the most dangerous mission because she can't live with the shame of being a useless aristocrat. Several days later, she heads into the city with Saito to watch the festival, but while Saito gets excited about it, she suddenly starts complaining about how the Albions clearly have no regard for the war since they are easily celebrating with Tristane soldiers. Saito then reminds her that Sheffield pulled out all their food supplies and left them stranded until Henrietta's soldiers decided to share the supplies they came with. Despite this, Louise continues rambling on about an aristocrat's honor as usual, so he decides to stay back and enjoy the festival with everyone else. Later, Louise answers Henrietta's summoning, but learns that they actually wanted to speak with Saito because they need his piloting skills for a spy mission to make sure Sheffield is observing the festival truce. After promising to get it done, Louise heads out to speak with Saito, but before getting close enough, she remembers how much he hates the war and decides to ask Giulio for help instead. Upon seeing this, Saito rushes over to ask where they are going, and after Giulio claims it's a date to tease her, she tells him not to bother acting concerned since he wants nothing to do with the war. After taking off, Giulio asks if she is really okay with Saito being upset, but she claims to not care about him anymore since he never seems to understand her. Saito, on the other hand, drags himself back into the city to watch the festival alone. However, Siesta suddenly runs up to hug him and fights back the tears as she explains how much she missed him. He then asks why she is an Albion, so she tells him about an uncle that plans to start a new business in the city before Scarin charges into him for a zesty hug. After Saito realizes that he is the uncle she plans to help, Scarin also gets shocked that they know each other and asks if Saito is the Riz master she keeps gunning to every night. He then proceeds to assault our boy for two-timing Luis before Siesta notices that he is alone and asks where she is. At the time, she and Giulio just got to the airspace above Albion's Capitol building, and while they scout the area for signs of a potential attack, Sheffield gets tired of listening to her cardinals and starts second-guessing her original plan until she spots Giulio's dragon. By then, Giulio has just noticed how upset she is, so he asks if she chose to ride with him just to keep Saito safe. She immediately tries to deny it, but he tells her not to worry because he understands just how much she cares for the dust-brained creep. The next moment, they see 3 dragon knights flying towards them, so Giulio tells her to hold on tight before evading all 3 dragons and commanding his dragon to unleash a powerful blast that knocks them all out. In a tent several minutes later, Jessica tells Saito that she can no longer root for Luis since Siesta is her cousin. He then realizes that having massive milkers must run in the family, and after Scarin also shows off his man Jugs, Gooch walks into the tent with excitement to show Saito the Medal of Bravery he won for his efforts on the battlefield. While they continue talking, Louise returns to her room and immediately asks Delfinger where Saito is, but he senses the emotions in her tone and asks if they had another fight. After she acts oblivious to the way she treated him and says he doesn't care about her, Delfinger reminds her that he decided to stay back in their world to be with her, only to receive her daily tantrums and endless whipping as his reward. Back in the tent, Gooch asks why she isn't with them as usual, and when Saito claims to not care what she is up to, Siesta tells Gitch to go call her if he wants to speak with her that badly. By then, Louise has just accepted that she might not be giving him the ideal treatment as a partner, but she still insists that he should just follow her orders and know what she is thinking at all times. Delfinger then tells her to stop being delusional and simply beg him to marry her like she actually wants. After blowing up the room in embarrassment, she reminds Delfinger that an aristocrat would never disrespect themselves for a peasant. But then Delfinger also reminds her that Saito comes from a world where there are no aristocrats and peasants. He then suggests expressing her emotions with a freaky costume costume and being his familiar for a day. So she changes into the outfit without realizing that Saito is coming back with everyone else. As soon as she hears the knob turning, she puts on the cheesiest display of cringe known to man and traumatizes everyone except Saito, who holds on to his sanity long enough to ask if she has finally lost it. Minutes later, they return to the tent, and after they all take turns teasing her, Siesta promises to win Saito's heart and runs off. Delfinger then tries to tell Saito that she put on the costume for him, but she immediately threatens him and claims to have done it so Julio would finally give her a cream pie. Just as Saito tells her to go be with Julio, since she wants his glizzy so badly, he shows up to stop her from leaving. But the real drama sets in when Siesta returns with a freaky bunny outfit and asks if she looks better than Louise. As her melons cause him to become delirious, Louise tries to stop Siesta, but ends up removing her melon wraps in front of everyone. Meanwhile, Sheffield has just taken one of her generals to the water channel that supplies the entire town, and after infecting it with the ring's power, she tells him to stick to the plan and vanishes without so much as a warning. Minutes later, Geach starts claiming that he met a real fairy during his battles, and after he says that she brought him back to life, Julio says that he was probably delirious from the blood loss. Siesta then says he should be happy that he survived whatever traumatic injuries he endured, but Geach claims that he was not bothered by it because dying during battle would seal his legacy as a true aristocrat. The next moment, Saito blows up and cusses him out for being so stupid that he now thinks his life only amounts to getting unalived in some meaningless war. As he continues rambling about how they should value their lives, Louise tells him to shut up if he can't understand what it means to be an aristocrat, but he refuses to hear another word and storms out. Moments later, Siesta catches up to him and tries to comfort him before suddenly claiming to be cold and asking for a private place to get warm. As soon as they enter a random hotel room, she confesses her feelings and locks lips with him, while Louise starts searching all over for him. Around the same time, the soldiers decide to get a drink at the town's main well, but after they all get a sip, Sheffield takes over their minds and orders them to attack each other. Moments later, Ains rushes into Henrietta's chambers to tell her that something is wrong with the soldiers, but she sees a fireball heading to the window and rushes to protect her while General Portier gets roasted alive. Saito notices the explosion as well, so he decides to head out. Siesta accepts that he will always go back to Luis and gives him a sleeping potion so he can knock her out and escape from the war completely. Meanwhile, Luis gets confused by the sudden battle raging between their own soldiers, so she starts calling out to Saito for help. In a matter of minutes, the city gets flooded with zombified soldiers hungry for blood, so Luis runs to the nearest alley to hide from them. Just then, one of the soldiers shows up to unalive her, but Saito saves her at the last moment. The following days, all the surviving locals rush to the port to board the ships, and while the remaining soldiers help them get on, Ains explains the situation to Henrietta and Marcini. After listening to everything, Marcini tells Henrietta to get on the next ship, but she refuses and says she will stay until every civilian has been safely evacuated. Shortly after this, Saito learns that Luis plans to stay back and fight at the last line of defense, so he asks why she would let them force her into acting as Henrietta's meat shield. She then reveals that Henrietta actually has no idea about it because it was Marcini who begged her earlier on after she refused to get on the ships. Despite this, Saito insists that it would be her most stupid decision yet because she still can't control her magic, but she insists on staying back and claims she will be able to control it to keep Henrietta safe. When he tells her that facing off against an army of 70,000 men is obviously way too much for a rookie mage to handle, she claims to be done expecting him to understand the importance of being an aristocrat. However, she then proceeds to give him a hug and tells him to return to his world instead of obsessing over keeping her safe. Upon hearing this, he pulls back to ask if she is being serious, and after seeing the tears running down her face, he turns away and decides to accept it. All of a sudden, she grabs a bottle of wine and suggests having a farewell toast since they might never see each other again. He then tries to open it up, but then she moves closer and suddenly asks for a wedding. This completely catches Saito off guard, but after she says she just doesn't want to get unalived without any proof that she lived, he agrees to it. Minutes later, she buys 2 magical flowers and refuses to explain what they are before taking him to a chapel for their ceremony. While she prays for their union, he mixes some of Siesta's potion into her wine and makes sure she drinks it all before asking about the kind of void they say during weddings. Before giving her a chance to answer, he tries to steal a kiss, so she attacks him before taking his hand and telling him the vows to say. As soon as he says the 3 magic words, she starts bawling her eyes out and explains just how strongly she feels for him. However, as soon as she also tries to say the magic words, the potion kicks in, so he carries her out and sees Julio waiting at the exit. Thankfully, Julia reveals that he also doesn't want her fighting Sheffield's army, so Saito hands her over to him and decides to do the fighting in her place. Hours later, Saito starts fighting the zombified soldiers to stop them from reaching the port while Ains rounds up the rest of the citizens so the ships can take off. Inside Henrietta's chambers moments later, she hears about Luis's plan to stay back and tries to leave the ship. But after Marcini drops to his knees and explains how terrible it would be for the nation if she gets clapped, she decides to stay but gets overwhelmed by guilt. Meanwhile, Luis finally wakes up on the deck and immediately tries to join the fight, but after seeing that they are already in the air, she asks for Saito. Julio then explains what he did and says he stayed back to keep her safe. Upon hearing this, Siesta immediately regrets giving him the potion and passes out while Luis rushes to the ship's edge and starts yelling his name, while Julio grabs a hold of her to make sure she doesn't fall. Saito sees Sheffield's army approaching and takes a moment to get his thoughts together before charging in to fight them all on his own. With help from Delfinger and his abilities, he manages to stay on his feet despite taking multiple powerful hits. But after a rain of arrows inflicts multiple injuries across his body, he quickly loses his energy and drops right at the center of the battlefield. The rest of Sheffield's soldiers then charge up their magic for one final attack against him, and after they unleash it, Louise sees the spark of life in her magic flower fading and breaks down as she realizes that he is gone. At the academy several days later, everyone struggles to accept the fact that their favorite creep is no more, and Louise continues crying in her room. So Eleanor shows up to remind her that none of this would have happened if she stayed home. When Louise ignores her and continues crying, she asks why such a lowly peasant is troubling her so deeply. The next moment, Louise snaps and explains how important Saito was before telling them both to get out of her room. After they leave, she starts confessing her love to Saito while holding the flower bottle until it suddenly starts glowing again. She then rushes out and keeps going until she sees him standing in the distance and freezes in shock. Upon seeing her, he immediately runs over to hug her, and after several minutes of holding each other, he explains how a hot fairy with monstrous milkers saved him and nursed him back to health with her melons. The next moment, she charges up her wand to punish him for having fun with a mythical baddie, so he runs into the academy to escape while everyone else gets excited to see that he is still alive. Siesta especially gets shocked when she sees him, but he loses his senses to her jugs as usual until Luis catches up to him. Days later, Saito wakes Luis up for an early couples workout, but she gets shy and tells him to stop staring. The next moment, he leans in for a kiss and says he can't hold back any longer, but when he reaches to take off her shirt, she shoves him back and says he has to wait until dark. Right then, Siesta barges in to wake him, so he jumps out of bed and assures her that he wasn't trying to do anything unholy with Louise. All of a sudden, Louise starts screaming and tells him to look at his hand because the rune is fading away. Minutes later, they all gather in the courtyard to hear Osmond give a speech about the war against Albion. After he tells them to take a moment of silence for the fallen soldiers, Augusta notices that Louise is lost in thought, so she tries to check on her, but Louise flips out and tells her to mind her business. Meanwhile, Saito takes a look at the rune again and sees that it's completely gone, so he asks Delfinger if it's something to be upset about. After saying that the rune serves as proof of Louise's ownership over him, Delfinger tells him to be excited because he is finally free to fall in love with a hottie like Siesta, who won't spend every waking moment traumatizing him. Just then, Eleanor and Katlia show up, so Saito tries to say hi, but Eleanor immediately tells him to save it because they only came to get Louise. The next moment, Augusta and all the other students hear about Saito's rune and start spinning theories about how it happened, while she gets even more upset about the fact that he doesn't belong to her anymore. When Eleanor tells her to stop brooding and summon another familiar, she refuses and says she only wants Saito, so Eleanor attacks her for talking back. Thankfully, Aang shows up and breaks up the fight before telling Luis and Saito that Henrietta wants to see them in the castle. In a carriage minutes later, Saito tries to start a conversation, but Luis tells him to move on with his life because she doesn't want him anymore. He gets surprised by this and still tries to talk, but she continues being rude, so he decides to match her energy. She then flips out and says she just wanted to make their separation easier for him. When Aang eventually stops for a break, she storms out of the carriage to be alone in the woods, but quickly gets frustrated after a couple of minutes of not having anyone to yell at. Just then, a tiny knight hands her a flower, and just as she starts to think that he just got separated from his parents, it pulls out a sword to attack, so she jumps back. All of a sudden, she starts hearing voices in the trees and demands to know who it is, so Sheffield responds and tells her not to bother trying to use void magic because the tiny knight already has his sword inches away from her throat. After Sheffield summons a bunch of demons to capture Louise, she uses her void magic to attack them and hopes that Saito will notice the explosion. However, Sheffield suddenly appears behind her and claims to be able to control all magical devices. After jumping back, Louise demands to know what she wants, so Sheffield starts by explaining that she isn't the only void mage before pulling back her hood to reveal the rune on her forehead. She then explains that her master is also a void mage and suddenly sends another demon to catch her off guard, but Saito shows up at the last moment to defend her. Louise gets surprised by this and reminds him that he is now powerless, but he insists on protecting her and says he doesn't need to be her familiar to do that. However, he immediately begs Delfinger for help because he has completely forgotten how to fight, so Delfinger helps him dodge all the demons until Aang shows up to help. At that moment, Sheffield's master tells her to retreat, and after she leaves, Louise unleashes her void magic and thanks Saito for coming out to help her despite not being her familiar anymore. Much later, they arrive in Henrietta's room and get surprised to see that it's empty, so she explains how she sold off most of her belongings to aid the war. She then grabs Louise's hand with tears in her eyes and apologizes for getting her involved with the war, but Louise stops her from begging and says she was glad to risk her life. The next moment, Henrietta hands Saito a letter and explains how she decided to appoint him as her chevalier for all his efforts during the war. He initially accepts it, but when Luis tells him that it means he is finally an aristocrat, he returns it to Henrietta and says he is now useless without his abilities. After hearing about what happened with the rune, Henrietta gets confused, but then Delfinger tells them that Luis's contract with him was probably nullified after his heart stopped. Henrietta then asks how he survived, so Delfinger explains how a fairy from a small village in Albion saved him. After Saito remembers what her name is, Henrietta tells Aang to go find her, and Saito asks to tag along since he can easily identify her. But Luis gets worried and says he might get attacked by Sheffield and her demons again. Hours later, Saito finds himself on the balcony stressing over the fact that he is not strong enough to fight such powerful enemies. Around the same time, Louise experiences a nightmare where he leaves her, and after waking up, she walks out to the balcony to yell as usual. However, after he rushes over to cover her up, she gets emotional and admits that she just doesn't want to be separated from him. He then promises to stay by her side, no matter what, and asks if she can just redo the contract between them. But she explains that the contract might summon another familiar or send him to another world. After giving it some thought, he insists that they should give it a shot and further explains that the love between them is way more important than any stupid contract. He then reminds her of their promise to smash in the night and tries to push her back inside so they can get busy. But she gets scared of taking his glizzy and blows him up. The next morning, she stops him from entering the carriage and makes him chase after it as punishment for trying to indulge in unholy activities. Several minutes later, Siesta arms herself with travel supplies and waits on the carriage trail until Aang pulls up with Saito still chasing after them. She then runs over to him and asks to join their trip, but Luis tries to send her away. So she opens all the boxes filled with cooking items to prove that she can be useful. Shortly after this, Louise lets her on the carriage with Saito, but she immediately starts cleaning him up and offers to do anything he wants. So Louise tells her to stay away because he is a shameless dog. To her greatest shock, Siesta refuses and says it shouldn't matter to her since he is no longer her familiar. Even after she attacks them for trying to get freaky right in front of her, Siesta offers to move in with Saito and take care of him after he leaves Louise. In an effort to discourage her, Louise tells her that they have a top-secret mission to complete for Henrietta and refuses to give her all the details. But then Saito explains that they are just going to look for the fairy that saved his life. Hours later, they find a spot to camp out for the night. And after Siesta serves Saito some food, he notices that Louise hasn't eaten anything, so he asks if she is okay. The next moment, she tells him to zip it and storms out, leaving him confused since he hasn't done anything else all day. After Siesta also leaves to clean up the dishes, Delfinger explains that Luis is just worried about how his missing rune will affect their relationship going forward. When Saito asks why she just won't try to create another contract, Delfinger explains that a mage has never been able to create contracts with the same familiar twice, which means a new contract will likely give her a new familiar, and this will, in turn, mean that they cannot stay together anymore. Just as Saito starts to understand why she has been acting up, Aang hands him a wooden sword and immediately attacks. As he scrambles to defend against her attacks, she reminds him that he never knew how to use a sword and was still able to fight in a war against powerful opponents. This causes him to regain some of the confidence he lost, and after he manages to land a shot to her neck, she accepts defeat and tells him to focus on his promise to keep Luis safe, no matter what. She then shows him that Luis has been watching them this entire time, but Luis quickly looks away and continues stressing over what might happen if she summons another familiar. Meanwhile, Saito decides to check on Siesta and overhears all the freaky things she is doing to him in a dream. The next day, they make it to the forest village of Westwood and tell Saito to look around in case he recognizes anything from when the hot fairy saved him. At that moment, he spots Stefania walking back home and runs out to stop her. But she gets startled and also starts running away, so he tells her his name. After she stops and recognizes him, Louise and Siesta also catch up but freeze in horror the moment they see the massive rack swinging across Stefania's chest as she runs into Saito. At a cabin hours later, Louise decides to interrogate them both and refuses to believe that Stefania is just a friend that saved his life because of how excited she was to see him. After Saito insists that she only brought him back from heaven, Stefania also tries to assure her that nothing else happened between them, but she suddenly grabs Stefania's melons and starts squeezing to figure out what Saito sees in them. The next moment, Saito pushes her back and tells her to stop disrespecting her. But this causes Luis to get emotional, so she runs out. Around the same time, Sheffield learns that there is another void mage in the village, so she starts heading towards them. Meanwhile, Luis has just started regretting her actions, but instead of apologizing, she decides to continue sobbing until Siesta shows up to take her back inside. On the way back, they both decide to unite and fight against Stefania's melons, but then Sheffield summons an army of Fenrir to surround them, and one quickly slams Luis's wand away. Sheffield then demands to know where the second void mage is, and after Luis says they have no idea what she is talking about, she sends the wolves to attack them. They both manage to survive the first attack, but Louise realizes that they need to get her wand back to escape. So Siesta runs over to grab it and tosses it to her before being jumped by a Fenrir. after Louise uses her explosion magic on the first wave. Saito hears the explosion and runs out to help. Sheffield then summons another wave of Fenrir to attack them and continues asking for the other Void Mage. While Saito desperately tries to find Louise, she continues attacking the endless waves of Fenrir, but eventually realizes that she is powerless to Sheffield's magic. So she decides to risk it all by trying the contract spell again. Upon seeing this, Sheffield stops the Fenrir from attacking out of curiosity and gets the shock of a lifetime when Saito jumps out of the portal to hug Louise. After she decides to leave, Saito notices that Louise is barely covered and looks away, but she hugs him from behind and asks if he is truly ready to be her familiar again. He immediately says yes and claims it's all he has ever wanted. So she summons the magic circle to seal their contract with a kiss. Just then, what starts out as a romantic moment takes a painful turn as Saito gets zapped with her magic and notices that the rune is back. The next moment, Siesta pounces on him with her cakes exposed and thanks him for coming to save her while Louise flips out. Minutes later, Sheffield tells Joseph about what happened, and while he tells her not to worry about it, Louise and Saito also explain what happened to Aang and Tefania. However, instead of celebrating the fact that Saito belongs to her again, Louise starts cussing him out again. The next day, Tefania gets anxious about leaving with them, so Aang promises to keep her safe throughout the journey. Minutes later, Saito notices that she still feels anxious, so he asks if she has motion sickness, but she explains that it just feels weird traveling so far from home. He then asks if she had always lived alone in the woods, so she tells him that her mum passed on recently. They both immediately apologize, but she tells them not to worry because it was probably what fate had in store for her. This causes Louise to remember what Sheffield said about there being another Void user, so she tries to take a closer look. But Tefania's melons trigger her insecurities. Days later, they finally arrive in Tristane and head straight to the palace to report to Henrietta, who then welcomes them back and gets excited to see that Saito got his powers back. When she asks if he is ready to become a Chevalier, Louise suggests dealing with that later, so she decides to focus on Tefania instead. However, when Tefania bows to greet her, Henrietta asks to see her face properly, and Louise immediately explains that it's disrespectful to keep one's face covered in front of the queen. Upon hearing this, Tefania takes off the hat to reveal her pointy ears and promises that she wasn't trying to hide the fact that she is an elf. After noticing the shocked look on their faces, she accepts that they already hate her. But Henrietta asks to hear life's story, so they head to a garden to talk. Tefania then explains that she is actually a half-elf because her pure breed mother was the mistress of the Duke of Albion. This surprises Henrietta for some reason, but she accepts it and tells Tefania not to worry about anything because her decision to save Saito's life despite not knowing him proves that she is good. Moments later, they all sit at her tea table to discuss what happened with Sheffield, and after listening carefully to Aang and Louise, Henrietta tells them to be careful since she might return to find the second Void user. She then asks Saito if he is ready to become a Chevalier, and while he gets excited to finally become an aristocrat, Joseph summons Sheffield. After she apologizes for being incompetent and useless, he tells her not to worry about it because he already has a new plan in motion. She then offers to do anything at all to please him, but he passes up the perfect opportunity to smash for his master plan. Hours later, Henrietta asks Elise for more details about her encounter with Sheffield, and after she explains how Sheffield kept saying there was a second Void user, she notices that Tefania has been staring at something and asks if she is okay. Tefania then shows her a ring she got from her mum and explains how the stone embedded in it brought Saito back to life. After reminiscing about how good her melons looked, Saito asks if she knows how he even got to the forest since he passed out on a field surrounded by enemies. Delfinger then explains that he was actually the one who teleported him into the forest, but he still insists on thanking Tefania for saving his life with her magic. After Tefania says it was no problem at all, Henrietta says that only a master of nature magic can bring someone back from the dead, which means that she has powers similar to the second Void user Sheffield is looking for. This suddenly causes Tefania to remember the tragic day she lost her mum, so she gets emotional and runs off. Saito immediately tries to chase after her, but Delfinger stops him and says she just needs time to process everything. Later that night, Saito hears a beautiful song playing in the distance and follows it until he sees Tefania singing on the roof. After sitting beside her, he apologizes for taking her so far away from home and admits to feeling a little bad about exposing her to an uncomfortable situation. She then tells him not to worry about it because she has always wanted to travel the world, but being a magical half-elf in a world that hated elves made that impossible. After thanking him for helping her escape her shell, she explains that her magic was passed down from her mum, but also admits to being scared of it. So Saito promises to help with anything she needs. Upon hearing this, she excitedly grabs his hands and thanks him for being an amazing friend. But he suddenly remembers how Louise usually responds to his baddie friends and runs away. The next day, Henrietta finally anoints Saito as a Chevalier, but then Siesta places a cape on him and calls him master before showing Louise a contract document signed by Henrietta to prove that she is his official servant. Louise immediately tries to fight over it, but quickly remembers that Henrietta is the queen, so she accepts it. Henrietta then says she has to head out for a conference with Tefania because they are actually cousins. Turns out, the Duke of Albion is Henrietta's uncle. but after Tefania agrees to it and says it's probably for the best, Saito tells her to follow them to the academy instead because she won't be able to fit in with all the nobles. After turning down the offer, she explains how difficult it would be to try and fit in with the rest of the students, but Saito insists that it won't be a problem since he will be there to protect her. The next moment, Luis smashes his toes and reminds him that his most important responsibility is to be her slave. But then Henrietta and Siesta also agree that going to the academy would be a good idea for Tefania. When she tries to turn it down again, Louise decides to control her insecurities for once and tells Tefania to stop letting her fear of judgment control her decisions. Just before leaving, Henrietta tells Saito to expect a surprise at the academy, so he asks for the slightest detail, but she refuses and tells him to find out when they get there. Much later, they arrive in the academy and find all the students gathered outside to celebrate Saito's new status as a chevalier. After Geach explains that Henrietta told him to give him a proper welcome, he and a bunch of other nerds welcome Saito to the Order of the Undine Knights and carry him off to the club room. Days later, Saito and the rest of the guys in the club continue another training session, while the girls watch and wonder why they are so obsessed with cosplaying as actual warriors. After noticing how upset Luis is, Augusta asks if she hasn't been spending time with Saito, but she flares up and claims it makes no difference to her. Just then, she hears a familiar voice and sees Tefania's golden globes swinging and causing major air turbulence as she runs towards Saito. As usual, she trips and stuffs his face with her milkers while everyone watches. But after getting up, she tells him about her decision to keep her ears hidden while learning to adjust to life as a student. The next morning, Saito tries to sneak out to train with the guys, but Luis captures him and asks why he has been leaving without saying a word to her. After saying that he was just going to train, Saito asks if she wants anything, but she gets shy and only tells him to come back early. Meanwhile, Geach notices that literally every guy on campus can't stop themselves from simping over Tefania, so he waits for Saito to come out before asking if her milkers are real. After he promises to find out even if he has to check them with his bare hands, Reynold suggests getting more people to join their club. Meanwhile, Louise decides to be the one doing something special for once, but instead of making an actual plan, she completely loses it and starts fantasizing about him begging for her forgiveness once he sees the surprise. As she takes it a step further by making out with her pillow, Sista gets traumatized and drops his laundry before shutting the door. By then, Saito has just found Tabita, and after making sure that she is also a chevalier, he asks if she wants to join the club, but she refuses and says she doesn't like playing wannabe knight with losers. Much later, he heads out to find other possible recruits and notices 3 female Sasquatches talking to Tefania. After they call her rude for not introducing herself to Princess Beatrice, she apologizes, but Beatrice refuses to accept it and tells her to take off the hat. Upon hearing this, Saito rushes over to defend Tefania and tells Beatrice to stop trying to bully her. When they ask if he knows who Beatrice is, he tries to give the usual nonchalant response, but Gichi swoops in to shut him up and tells Beatrice not to bother herself with a low-level peasant like him. After she takes the bait and leaves, Geach takes them aside and explains that Beatrice is not the type of princess to be messed with because she has an entire unit of the strongest dragon knights guarding her. Despite this, Saito insists on protecting Tefania and says he doesn't care about anyone's status. Hours later, Luis hears him outside the room and gets excited to have their special dinner together. But after walking in, he tells her not to bother because he already had dinner with Geach. He then makes the mistake of saying Tefania's name in an effort to ask her for help, and she completely loses it. This time though, he snaps back at her for not trying to listen and storms out, so she spends the rest of the night thinking of new reasons to hate him. By morning, Siesta shows up to clean after Saito, but after spotting the untouched meal Luis made for him, while Luis continues cussing Saito out, Tefania decides to fix her relationship with everyone in class. Moments later, Chevreuse starts calling her name and almost marks her as absent, but then she walks in, dressed like Walmart Peter Pan, and apologizes for keeping them all in the dark. She then pulls the hood down to proudly show off her pointy ears, but all the students immediately scramble to find safety, so she promises that she would never do anything to harm them. While they all try to stop pissing themselves and refuse to accept that she is a good elf, Beatrice gets even more upset because Tefania now has more clout than her. However, when Tefania explains that she is actually a half-elf to make them all feel better, she gets an idea and asks Tefania for the god she worships. Tefania then takes a moment to think and says she is willing to accept whichever one makes them feel at peace with her, but Beatrice ignores this and summons her knights to arrest her. Moments later, Saito spots Tefania being carried off by a dragon, so he chases after it to save her. After the dragon drops her in a courtyard minutes later, Beatrice claims to be a bishop and says she has the right to conduct an inquiry to make sure Tefania is actually good. However, instead of just asking her questions, she prepares a large pot of boiling water and tells Tefania to jump inside because it won't harm anyone who worships their god. Upon hearing this, Saito loses it and tries to stop her. Just then, Beatrice offers to pardon Tefania if she returns to whatever hole she crawled out of, but she refuses. Upon hearing this, Beatrice loses it and orders her knights to toss Tefania into the pot, so Saito tries to stop them again, but Geach still holds him back and says his punishment will also affect Louise. After reminiscing on the extremely rare happy moments they occasionally share together, Saito decides to beg Beatrice on Tefania's behalf, but she still refuses to let her go. Saito then grabs Delfinger to fight, but her knights quickly slam the sword away. So Geach and the other guys in the wannabe nightclub decide to fight for Saito and Tefania. As they all clash swords with Beatrice's knights, Louise drifts off into a dream where she and Saito share a very special moment, but the sound of so many swords clashing interrupts her freaky dream, so she wakes up with a strong desire to unalive someone. Minutes later, Saito and his nerd squad stop to take a break, but then Louise shows up and blows up the entire courtyard with her magic. Beatrice warns her about the consequences of interrupting an inquiry, but Louise tells her to stop the cap because there is no way a midget loudmouth like her could become a judge without receiving the signature of the Secretariat head. Upon hearing this, the female Sasquatches deny knowing who she is and claim they would never associate with someone who uses the name of their god for personal beef. Beatrice quickly realizes her mistake and panics, but then Tefania walks over and asks to be her friend, so she breaks down in tears and hugs her. Much later, Gechi gets swarmed by hot freshman chicks in the infirmary. Saito, on the other hand, wonders how long he has to stay in the infirmary, but then Tefania walks in and shuts the blinds. She then asks if her melons look real, so Saito offers to check them for her. However, just as things start heating up between them, Louise walks in with Siesta and takes a moment to make sure her eyes are actually working before calmly asking Siesta for a whip. The next day, Louise makes him read out a confession admitting that he willingly fondled Tefania's milkers with the intention of cheating, so he reluctantly admits just to get out of the punishment she is forcing on him. However, she goes a step further by telling him to sign the confession, so Siesta asks if it is really necessary to be this hard on him. After Louise refuses to be a little lenient with him, he tosses the confession and refuses to sign it before storming out. Moments later, Delfinger tells him to try seeing things from her perspective, but he refuses right before spotting Colbert's lab. Once inside, Saito starts looking through all his stuff and reminisces on the conversations they used to have before the war. Meanwhile, Louise continues fuming over his betrayal and wonders why he isn't satisfied with the melon seeds on her chest. A couple hours later, Saito wakes up in the lab and decides to take a walk around campus, but then he sees a new member of the Wannabe Knights Club receiving gifts from a bunch of girls. He then enters the club room and meets Reynold, who explains that girls became addicted to members of the club after the fight with Beatrice's knights. The next moment, Saito sees that Gitch also received gifts from his adoring fans, but Margarita shows up to question his loyalty. However, instead of attacking him, she admits to feeling bad about all the attention he has been receiving from girls, and this causes Saito to realize that Louise is actually the problem. To make matters worse, he sees that Maricorn also managed to find love with a peaceful hottie and wonders why he never experiences such good luck. Much later, Louise gets upset as she realizes that Saito doesn't want to come back to the room, but when Siesta shows up to ask about it, she immediately denies her emotions and acts like he means nothing to her. Meanwhile, Saito ends up in the kitchen having dinner with Marteau and eventually heads out to feed Tabita's dragon. Upon seeing this, Gyuch and Maricorn get worried about his mental health, so Gimli suggests showing him the Forbidden Land to help him feel better. Shortly after this, Louise heads into the bath to soak up but continues stressing over her relationship with Saito. After getting into the water, she wonders if her milkers will ever get big enough for him, and Tefania shows up right on time with her monster melons to remind Louise that some miracles are simply impossible. By then, Gitch and the others had just led Saito to a secret hole they used to watch the girls bathe, but things take a weird turn when he spots Louise and Tefania talking. After Tefania thanks her for helping with Beatrice and apologizes for having massive melons, Louise acts like she was never upset with her in the first place. All of a sudden, Tefania asks to grab her melons and says she needs to know what regular ones feel like. She then places Louise's hands on her milkers before grabbing hers as well. Upon seeing this, Saito gets worried that the other guys will see them as well, but they quickly pull him aside to enjoy the view. Moments later, Tefania stops and tells Louise that she has been feeling insecure about her milkers because everyone says they look unreal. When she explains how she had to ask for Saito's opinion yesterday, Louise realizes that he was telling the truth and starts feeling bad. Tefania then apologizes for making him grab her melons since they are lovers, but Louise immediately denies it and says she only sees him as her familiar. Just then, Saito tells Gitch and the others to stop looking, but they accidentally crack the wall, causing the girls to finally notice their peephole. After knocking Saito out, they all escape back to the surface, but the girls show up right on time to catch them. While they immediately start attacking them, Delfinger tells Saito to say his last prayers, but a crazy whirlwind suddenly transports him to the ballroom. He then hears Tabita saying that she saved him for feeding her dragon. However, Margarita suddenly storms in looking for Gyuch, so Tabita grabs Saito to hide, which wouldn't be a problem if she wasn't completely exposed and pressing her plots against his glizzy. Thankfully, Margarita eventually leaves, but Tabita still grabs him even tighter and says she is scared of ghosts before passing out in his arms. Just then, he realizes that the ballroom is filled with dancing dolls, so he takes a look around and sees one that reminds him of the night he danced with Louise. He then realizes that he is part of the reason she can't trust him and decides to own up to his faults. Just then, she shows up to ask about the peephole, and after admitting that he was there, he explains that Gooch and the others never told him what they were going to look at. He still admits that it was wrong, so she also apologizes for not trusting him, but says he has to give her a kiss to prove that he only has eyes for her. After hugging her from behind, he claims to only like small melons like hers and tries to give her the kiss. But Tabitha wakes up and falls right back to sleep after seeing that it's just them. Like clockwork, Louise becomes convinced that he was cheating again and attacks him. The next morning, he ends up back on his knees and actually signs the pledge to never touch another pair of melons, but then Siesta suddenly places his hand on hers, causing Louise to lose it. Later that night, Siesta pays a visit to Scarron and Jessica to talk about her miserable love life, and after listening, they get upset that she isn't doing everything to steal Saito's heart. After she claims to be okay competing with Louise, Jessica reminds her that Louise has way more power than her before pulling out a love potion a customer once tried to use on her. Siesta initially hesitates because using potions is illegal, but they both insist that it's the only way to get ahead of Louise, so she agrees to use it on Saito. However, after cleaning up Louise's room the next day, she gets scared and wonders if it's really the right decision. Just as she starts fantasizing about being in love with Saito, Louise drags him inside and says she is still punishing him for being a shameless freak. Upon seeing this, Siesta gets pissed and says she is going too far and shouldn't even be his master if she can't trust him. After also getting pissed, Louise tells her to try taking care of him for 1 hour, and Siesta excitedly agrees to it. Minutes later, Gooch and Reynolds spot Siesta dragging him along and think they are the lucky ones since their only punishment for peeping on the girls is to weed the entire academy. Maricorn, on the other hand, gets fed up with the punishment and says he can't go on, so Tefania apologizes for forcing it on him. Margarita then reminds her of the sins they committed, and when Gooch tries to defend their actions, she threatens to beat him up if they don't focus on cutting grass. By then, Siesta has just taken Saito into her room and explains that they have to act like a newly married couple since she rarely gets a chance to spend alone time with him. This surprises Saito, but he eventually agrees to play along and asks if she already knows what to do. The next moment, Siesta's face blows up as she considers slipping him the potion, and after drinking a glass of water, things get even worse because Scarron suddenly shows up with Jessica to check on her, and after telling them to leave, she slams the door and returns to the table to play house with Saito. For starters, she asks if he wants actual food for lunch or if he wants a face full of kitty, but he immediately turns down a chance to smash for real food. By then, Louise has started regretting her decision to let Siesta have him, and after thinking about all the unholy games they might be playing together, she storms out to get him back. Meanwhile, Jessica and Scarron convince her to still use this opportunity to get the D, even if he wants regular food. After she agrees to use their plan, they drop her clothes to make sure she actually looks good under it. Moments later, she serves Saito a Michelin star meal, but the real shock sets in when he sees that she dressed herself like the perfect dessert. Instead of eating the food he asked for, he tries to get a taste of her cakes instead, but Louise shows up at the window and threatens to unalive him before flying off with Tabitha. Saito then decides to keep his intrusive thoughts under control, but after seeing Siesta's cakes as she bends over, he runs out to use the men's room. While he obsesses over what to do next, Siesta pulls out a potion and tries to convince herself that using it is the right thing to do. Just as she makes up her mind, it slips and falls right into Margarita's hands. She immediately recognizes it since she once tried to use it on Gooch, but Louise Tabitha's dragon suddenly blows all the powder up her nose. She then tries to blame Louise, but the potion takes over, so she drags Louise into a bush to make out. In the process of kissing her, Margarita transfers some of the potion, so Louise also becomes delirious and falls in love with Jessica the moment she lays eyes on her. After Jessica manages to dodge her kiss, Margarita also falls in love, so they both try to run a three-way with her before spotting Tabitha and deciding to kiss her as well. Luckily, Tabitha uses her wind magic to blow them away and takes off on her dragon. Back in Siesta's room, she completely ignores the chain reaction she just set off to get romantic with Saito, but he hears all the noise outside and runs out to see for himself. By then, Margarita has just spread the love virus to Beatrice, and after Louise also kisses Jessica, the entire academy turns into a breeding ground filled with delirious hotties looking for their next victim. Even Scarron ends up on their radar and captures Saito as soon as he also gets a kiss, but Saito cracks his nuts and manages to escape. Tefania, on the other hand, fails to escape the girls as they all chase her into a wall. However, after realizing that they are under some sort of spell, she uses her magic to bring them back to reality. The next moment, Scarron and Jessica take off to avoid getting arrested, leaving Siesta, who then admits that she was the one behind it. Luckily, they completely forget everything that happened and decide to take her off with a warning. Hours later, Tabitha receives a message and quickly flies out to meet Sheffield, who then tells her that Joseph wants her to capture Saito and Louise. After telling Tabita that this might be the only way to cure her mother, she flies off. Several nights later, Siesta joins Saito and Luis in bed to continue working her magic on him, but Luis gets pissed off and asks why she is even sleeping with them in the first place. Siesta then reminds her that Henrietta appointed her as Saito's maid, which gives her every right to sleep beside him. After Luis says she has the superior right over him as the mage who summoned him, Siesta decides to have a contest to decide who gets to keep him. Luis initially tries to talk her way out of it, but when Siesta asks if she is just scared that Saito will prefer her milkers, she agrees to it. Siesta then explains that whoever he finds first during the Sleipnir ball wins, and while they return to bed, a mysterious creature hovers above the Academy's airspace. While having breakfast the next day, Miracorn tells Saito that the Sleipnir ball is a magic dance held every year where they get to transform into their ideal versions using a magic mirror. As Gitch continues explaining how it works and how he plans to become the guy of every girl's dream, Saito overhears two guys talking about the mysterious creature from last night and runs over to ask for more details. After hearing about how a dragon knight saw its shadow and nearly pissed himself, Saito starts wondering if Sheffield is plotting something new for Louise. He immediately runs back to the dorm to warn her but finds Siesta lying on the ground, so he asks if she is okay. She then explains a book she read about the freaky relationship between a master and his slave, before acting like she broke something valuable and asking him to punish her. At first, he gets confused and wonders if she is having brain processing issues, but after she carefully explains it again and pulls her skirt up, he loses touch of reality and decides to play along. Right then, Luis cracks his nuts and promises to let him continue what he started the other night if he manages to find her first at the ball. Hours later, all the students show up to the ballroom, and after Chevrus explains how to use the magic mirror, Louise walks in and gets transformed into Catlia. While she joins the rest of the students and prays Saito will be able to find her, he runs over to the building to start looking but suddenly notices the creature everyone has been talking about. Back inside, Osman has just given the opening speech and also tells everyone that Henrietta has joined the dance in disguise to get them all excited. After listening to him yap for a couple more minutes, the rest of the students continue using the magic mirror to transform themselves. However, after Gimli, Margarita, and Mericorn get their dream transformations, Gooch walks out looking exactly the same and says he can't think of anyone better. The next moment, an absolute goddess walks out, so Gitch drops to his knees to kiss her hand, only to learn that it's actually Principal Osman. While Beatrice and her sorority girls argue over the fact that they all transformed into Tefania, Louise gets worried that Saito won't find her before bumping into him. However, just as she gets excited, she notices that he now has melons and gets terrified until Tefania explains that it's actually her. Minutes later, Saito makes it to the balcony and wonders why no one is wearing an actual costume, without realizing that their faces are the costume. He then spots Louise and rushes over to tell her about the creature, but after noticing that her lips look unusually good, he reminds her of the promise to let him smash if he finds her. Louise, who is actually Henrietta, gets confused but realizes that he wants a kiss, so she leans in to give it to him while Sheffield sneaks in and knocks Chevries out to stop the effects of the magic mirror. Just then, Saito realizes that he has been making out with the queen, so he drops to his knees to apologize before asking why she would even want to be Louise. After admitting to feeling jealous of Louise's life and the way she acts, Henrietta apologizes for tricking him and leans in for another kiss. The next moment, they hear a glass cup breaking and see tears running down Louise's face before she runs off. Saito immediately chases after her and manages to stop her, but she refuses to listen and pushes him off before running into the woods. He runs out again to find her, but this time he spots Tabita, who then attacks him with her staff. Meanwhile, Sheffield finds Elise in the woods and convinces her to join the dark side since Saito and Henrietta have already betrayed her. While she reinforces the mind control, Saito blocks Tabita's attacks and continues asking why she is doing this. But she continues fighting until Sheffield returns with Louise and tells him to stop asking questions because Tabita is now loyal to her. The next moment, Tabita tries to finish him off, but he still manages to block it and pins her down. She then asks why he didn't stab her instead, so he reminds her of all the times she saved them and says he would never betray a friend even if it's to save Louise. Upon hearing this, Tabita leaves, so Saito starts calling out to Louise until she snaps out of the hypnosis. However, she refuses to jump off Sheffield's flying stingray and starts stomping on it while expressing her anger, so Sheffield tries to stop her. In that moment, she accidentally pushes Louise off, and after Saito catches her, she continues fighting until he shuts her up with a kiss. Delfinger then tells them to save it for later because Sheffield just summoned an army of demons, but they all suddenly get blown to bits. The next moment, the flying creature appears, and they both get shocked to see Colbert waving down at them with Augusta. Early the next day, Colbert and Augusta set the ship down outside campus, so Louise and Saito climb on to ask every question they can think of. Colbert starts by explaining how Augusta decided to invest in his research, and after she also explains her decision to move him into her family's estate, Louise and Saito tell him how painful it felt to hear that he had passed on. Augusta then tells them that Tabita had actually used a spell back then to slow down his heartbeat, and when Louise asks why she didn't say anything sooner, she explains that there was never a good time to bring it up. Minutes later, Saito ends up at the edge of the ship thinking about his fight with Tabita, and when Delfinger suggests telling the others about it, he refuses and says it won't be nice to bring it up when he barely understands why she attacked him in the first place. Just then, Louise notices his concerned expression and becomes convinced that it's because of what happened with Henrietta, so she walks over to demand answers from him. After giving it some thought, he acts like he was just having a regular conversation with Henrietta to avoid talking about it, but Luis gets pissed and drags him by the face. Thankfully, Geach suddenly decides to assemble every member of their wannabe Knights Club, so Saito runs off to join them. As she tries to stop him, Siesta shows up to remind her of their little contest, and when Luis tries to play dumb, she realizes that it must be because Saito never found her during the dance. However, Henrietta suddenly shows up to see the ship, so Siesta forgets about the contest and starts gushing over her beauty. Henrietta then commends Colbert for creating such an amazing ship, but he tells her to praise Saito instead since it was his advice that brought the project to life. All of a sudden, Henrietta's tone changes as she tries to address Saito, and Siesta notices this, so Luis takes her inside the ship to explain what happened last night. Like always, she overreacts and tells Luis that they have to do something because competing against an actual queen for Saito's glizzy is pointless. Luis then tries to calm her down, but she pulls out one of her forbidden love novels to narrate a scene where the queen turned her most trusted knight into a love slave. As she continues explaining how disadvantaged they are, Tefania shows up to check on them. Meanwhile, Colbert finds Saito lost in thought again and joins him to talk about how he has always wanted to travel the world. Around the same time, Henrietta starts reminiscing on the kiss with Saito and considers getting another one, but her attendants remind her that it's time to head back to the palace. By then, Luis and Siesta have just given Tefania a full rundown of what happened, and after noticing how troubled Luis is about everything, she pulls out a special orb used to see what a person did the previous night. Luis immediately refuses to take it and claims to trust Saito completely, but when Siesta decides to take it, she quickly grabs it back and decides to use it on him. Minutes later, Colbert starts explaining how the ship runs to Saito, but he suddenly gets distracted by a blue dot moving across Colbert's face and spots Louise. All of a sudden, Delfinger tells him to run without looking back, so Saito takes off and continues dodging Louise until he enters the ship's engine room, as he gets distracted by the complex machinery Colbert designed to make it run. Tefania runs inside and grabs him with her milkers before calling Louise. She and Siesta then try to grab a hold of him, but he slips through Tefania's arms and escapes while they end up grabbing her milkers instead. Moments later, Augusta slips into the control room so Colbert can use his special machine on her kitty, but Saito suddenly runs inside and catches them in the act. After apologizing, he tries to run out, but Luis locks him down with her legs and finally uses the orb on him. However, instead of seeing what happened with Henrietta, they see his fight with Tabita and get concerned, so he explains what happened in more detail and says Sheffield made her do it. Despite this, Louise remains heartbroken and asks why she would ever want to betray them. So Augusta decides to explain what happened to Tabita's mother and how she started working for Joseph, who turns out to be the older brother who unalived her dad to seize the throne of Gallia. Upon hearing all this, Saito gets pissed and decides to go fight for her, but Louise gets worried because this is technically the first time Tabita has failed a mission, which means they might try to punish her. By then, Tabita has just arrived at her family's estate, and after telling her dragon to wait outside, she rushes to her mother's room. However, after only finding her doll on the ground, an elf named Vidal walks out and tells her to surrender so he can reunite her with her mother. Tabita immediately tries to attack, but he blocks it with nature magic and knocks her out. Sylphid then tries to protect her, but Vidal uses the same nature magic to knock her out cold before taking Tabita. Back at the academy, Saito and Luis have just met up with Henrietta to request permission to help Tabita, but Henrietta grabs Saito's hand to talk him down. After realizing that she is doing way too much, she pulls away and promises to handle it before telling them not to do anything rash. Minutes later, they all assemble outside the academy to see her off, and while Siesta complains that they were never able to figure out what happened between Saito and Henrietta, Louise decides to trust that he would never do anything to betray her. Soon after this, everyone starts searching every inch of campus to find something, and while Louise accidentally grabs Tefania's melons, Margarita gets worried and asks Gitch if he plans to go to Gallia on the off chance that Tabita is actually in trouble. He then tries to thank her for loving him despite all his recent escapades, but she gets pissed and says it's because he will definitely find some foreign baddie to rizz up in Gallia. Meanwhile, Saito also grabs a weird pair of milkers, but gets traumatized when he realizes that they actually belong to Maricorn. To make matters worse, Maricorn proceeds to smear Saito's face all over his floppy man melons before breaking down and saying he can't wait to get a girlfriend. All of a sudden, they hear an explosion and turn around to see a chick named Coco standing with no plot covers on. After she hugs Saito, Luis cracks open his jewels and demands to know why she is shamelessly displaying her plots for everyone to see. Coco then says they have to help her older sister, but they still remain confused until she claims to be Tabita's younger sister. Minutes later, they take her in the club room to ask for details, so she explains how Tabita got arrested and lost her rank as a chevalier for failing to complete her mission. She also tells them that her mum got captured as well, and when Louise asks if she has any idea where to find Tabitha, she explains what happened with Vidal and begs them to save Tabitha. Upon hearing this, Maricorn promises to help her no matter the cost, but Geach and the others refuse and say she might actually be a spy sent from Gallia. Geach also points out the fact that she can't possibly be Tabitha's little sister since her plots are way more developed. But Maricorn insists that she can be trusted just to increase his chances of smashing. After saying that she can prove it, Coco suddenly runs out, so they try to stop her but end up seeing Sylphid. As soon as she lands, Saito asks about what happened to Tabitha as well as Coco's claims of being her little sister, and after Sylphid agrees to everything Coco said, they all decide to join forces to get Tabitha back. However, Reynald reminds them that they are technically Henrietta's private knights, which means they can't do anything without her permission. Saito immediately tries to argue about it, but even Gitch agrees that they need approval from Henrietta, so he begs Louise to talk to her since they are childhood friends. While she starts thinking about what happened at the dance and wonders how it will affect their friendship, Vidal drops Tabitha off in Joseph's office and reminds him to hold up his end of their deal. After commending him for easily defeating Tabitha, Joseph tells him to make any demand, so Vidal tells him about the Gate of Shytown, a powerful gate in the Holy Land that has apparently been holding back evil forces seeking to destroy the world as they know it. He also tells Joseph about a prophecy among the elves that says a powerful devil will rise after 4 lesser devils, more commonly known as void magic users, meet. With that said, he asks Joseph to make sure no one comes close to the gates anymore and offers to give him access to mine the rarest mineral in the world as payment. But Joseph turns down the offer and tells Vidal to become his servant until he dies. Vidal gets surprised by this but realizes that he doesn't have much of a choice, so he agrees to it. After he leaves, Joseph picks Tabitha up and promises to give her the same poison that turned her mum into a psychotic nutcase. Much later, Saito and Louise arrive at the palace for a meeting with Henrietta, but after he explains everything they know and says he has to go help Tabitha, Henrietta refuses to let him go and says they will only be causing harm to Tristane because Gallia might see their efforts as a direct attack on their nation. Upon hearing this, Saito hands over his cloak and says he is willing to give up his new status as a Chevalier, so Geach and Maricorn both do the exact same thing to show how serious they are. The next moment, Henrietta rings a bell for Agnes to come in and tells her to arrest them. Minutes later, Coco returns to the club room to tell the others what happened, and when Tefania asks how she even knows, she tries to deny it. Then Augusta shows up and saves her from revealing the truth. Back in the palace, Geach starts yapping about how more hotties will become obsessed with him for standing up to the princess, while Maricorn bawls his eyes out because he might never see Coco again. On the other hand, Louise asks Henrietta why she took such harsh measures on them, and when she explains that losing another person dear to her will be too much to handle, Louise asks for the truth about her feelings for Saito. After an unusually long pause, Henrietta admits her feelings and says she can't help it because she feels incredibly lonely, but this causes Louise to get pissed. However, she manages to control her anger and tells Henrietta that she won't let anyone steal Saito away from her. The next moment, Henrietta apologizes for trying to come in between what they both had and tells Louise to convince him to stay since she also cares deeply about him. But Louise also hands over her cape. After she says that Tabitha is also a very important person they all have to help, Henrietta decides to do the next best thing and sends her to join the boys in prison. While Geach and Maricorn actually start losing their minds, Saito, impressed by her sacrifice, starts praising her. Meanwhile, Tabitha finally wakes up in a room and sees Vidal, who then takes her to see her mother. After rushing over to check on her, she asks Vidal for their plans. So Vidal explains how Joseph plans to administer the same poison that destroyed her mum's brain before telling her not to bother trying to escape. He then hands over a book and tells her to enjoy being sane for as long as she can because the poison takes a bit of time to make. Back in the cell, Saito gets tired of scraping walls and asks Louise why she isn't helping since this is her escape plan. So she tells him to shut up and work so she can put her supercomputer brain to work. Saito then asks Maricorn why he casually had a whole cutlery set in his pants. So he reminds them of his food addiction. The next moment, they get stunned by a loud voice announcing Colbert and Augusta's ship as it flies through the capital city. Using the distraction, Augusta blows up the cell door to bust them out, and after they all run out and meet the others, Louise asks how they even knew about the arrest. Coco then tries to cook up another story, but Delfinger tells her to drop the act, so she takes a step back before using nature magic to return to her dragon form. While they all freeze in shock, Delfinger explains that she is from an ultra-rare dragon species still thought to be extinct. Soon after this, Agnes apologizes to Henrietta for losing them and says they have already seized Colbert's ship before promising to get them back no matter what. As she turns to leave, Henrietta tells her to make sure nothing happens to them. Meanwhile, Scarron and Jessica get worried about all the commotion and consider closing up shop for the day. The next moment, Saito grabs his shoulder, which nearly gives him a heart attack. Minutes later, they explain everything that happened, and after calling them brave for giving up their titles and status for Tabitha, he asks if they have an actual plan to escape the city. Just then, Colbert pulls up a map and explains his plan to divert Agnes and the soldiers by driving it to Germania so Saito and the others can use the distraction to walk all the way to Gallia through a second border. After they all agree to it, Scarron asks if they have really considered the risk of blatantly disrespecting Henrietta. As they all take turns stating that they are willing to do anything for Tabitha, Scarron decides to help out and asks Jessica to help him get something important. Saito then asks Colbert how he plans to get the ship up and running, but he tells them to focus on getting to Gallia. Upon hearing this, Augusta gets worried and says he can't possibly handle it alone, so Reynold and Gimli offer to help him out. Siesta, on the other hand, tells Saito that she will follow him to the ends of the earth, so Louise reminds her that he is not a chevalier anymore, which means her duties as his maid have also been revoked. Despite this, Siesta insists on serving him and tells Louise that she also has no right over him since her status as an aristocrat has also been revoked. Saito then tries to stop them from arguing and gets yelled at, while Gooch and Maricorn get jealous since they typically have to commit some sort of crime to get that much attention. Just then, Scarron and Jessica return with a bunch of costumes from some of their carnival friends and tell them to use it as disguises to avoid the soldiers. Minutes later, they both start laughing at Maricorn for dressing like plus-size Pennywise and refuse to stop until the girls show up dressed like the baddies. Creeps like you goon to every night. Upon seeing that Margarita is a little shy about her outfit, Augusta tells her to stop feeling insecure because she actually has a hot bod, unlike a certain flatboard who won't shut up about Saito. As usual, Luis immediately starts an argument over it, so Saito jumps in to separate them. Siesta then decides to go with Colbert instead and admits that she would just be holding them back, so Saito thanks her for acknowledging her own weakness and promises to make sure they succeed. This causes Siesta to get emotional, so she gives him a hug and squeezes her milkers into his chest until Luis cracks his jewels. While they all prepare to head out, Tabitha reads a story to her mum and becomes convinced that she deserves the poison for betraying Saito. Meanwhile, Sheffield, who has been watching her this entire time, realizes that Joseph just walked in to check on their secret project, so she leads him through the facility to explain all the progress. After he tells her to skip the boring stuff, she takes him to a large chamber being used to recharge a giant beast. Hours later, Colbert finds the ship but also notices that there are soldiers patrolling, so he takes a moment to think before telling Siesta to strip. Around the same time, Saito and the rest of the gang get noticed by soldiers stationed close to the border, so they all start praying that the disguises work. Luckily, the soldiers get too distracted by the girls to run a proper check, so they continue heading for the border. However, while talking about Colbert and how he has to handle a lot more risk, Saito notices that Louise has been staring at him with a concerned look on her face, so he asks if she is okay. She then acts like it's nothing but remembers when Siesta said she no longer has any control over him. While they continue walking to the border, Siesta walks out to meet the patrolling soldiers, but they immediately tell her to go back, so she pulls up her skirt to scramble their brains with her thick legs. The next moment, Reynold and Gimli knock them out cold, but an entire unit of soldiers hear the noise and start running to capture them. Upon seeing this, they hurry into the ship, and while Colbert fires up the engines, Gimli and Reynold load up the coal chamber to increase the juice. Luckily, they manage to break free of the chains in time. But when Siesta tells Colbert to pick up the speed, he reminds her that they still have to keep Agnes and the other soldiers distracted long enough for Saito to escape with the girls. Around the same time, Joseph commends Sheffield on doing such an amazing job with the project, but she gets upset and tells him about what Henrietta and Agnes are trying to do to Louise and Tefania. She then offers to go intercept them at the border, but he tells her not to worry since Vittel is still around, and also says it would be fun to see Tabitha's reaction to everything before they administer the poison. Shortly after this, Agnes's soldiers catch up to the ship and begin blasting its propellers to bring it down. So Gimli and Reynold try to fight back, but Colbert stops them and says they just have to keep them busy for a little while longer. At that moment, Louise sprains her ankle, so Saito runs over to help her, almost causing Maricorn to get crushed by the carriage. As usual, she tries to reject his help, but instead of starting a fight, he calmly tells her to start trusting him again, so she climbs his back. By then, Colbert has just realized that they can't keep outrunning Agnes, so he decides to surrender. However, after he lands the ship and steps out, Agnes loses it and immediately tries to attack, since she also didn't know that he is still alive. She eventually decides to control her anger for the sake of Henrietta, so they start heading back to the capital city while Saito and the others make it inside Gallia. At a restaurant in Gallia a couple hours later, they all try to figure out a plan to find Tabitha. But then a drunk soldier starts complaining about how he had to move two blue-haired foreigners to a special building, one of the royal castles. Augusta immediately joins him and uses her charm to get as much information as possible before telling Saito and the others where they can find Tabitha. By morning the next day, she further explains that they have to make over 100 soldiers fall asleep at once to be able to sneak into the castle and save Tabitha. After Margarita offers to make the sleeping pills to knock them out cold, Geach decides to get the drink, but Saito still wonders how she plans to knock over 100 soldiers out. The next moment, Tefania and Coco walk in dressed like top-tier 8 strippers, and after the boys lose a couple brain cells, Augusta explains that she plans to lure all the soldiers with a steamy dance performance. After agreeing on the plan, they all head out to start working on it. but Luis gets upset because they left her out of the dance performance, so Augusta offers to get her an outfit as well, but says it would be pointless since no one wants to see her bones twerking on stage. Like always, she gets upset and asks Augusta why she always picks on her, but then Augusta tells her to stay back inside with Saito because they will actually need her powers if things get heated. This surprises Luis since Augusta has never acknowledged her abilities, so Augusta takes it a step further, pulling her in closer for a hug. Minutes later, Saito heads out to give her some space, but after Delfinger tells him to also give her some words of encouragement, he goes back inside and gets an eye full of plot as she changes into the dancing robe. After he turns his back to keep little Johnny under control, she realizes that it's the perfect opportunity to tease him, so she tells him to look, but he refuses and says he came for something else. Frustrated, she starts tugging on the robe and jokes about taking it off to see if he can continue holding back. Eventually, he caves and shoves her down onto the bed, but just as he leans in for a kiss, Geach shows up, so she kicks him in the untouchable zone and claims they were just practicing a very special dance. Meanwhile, Hangs decides to release Colbert from jail and takes him on a walk across the facility to explain her new decision to spare his life despite the fact that he burned down her entire village. After siesta and the boys wave to him from the ship, she further explains that unavailing him would have just started a new cycle of hate similar to what she experienced. By then, Augusta has just met with a baron in charge of controlling the soldiers to discuss their performance, so he takes one look at the rest of the group and accepts with a special condition. Hours later, Maricorn kicks off the performance and almost gets attacked by the extremely depraved soldiers who have probably not seen a good pair of cakes in ages. While Augusta, Coco, and Tefania steal the show with their deadly dances, Luis desperately tries to rattle her sack of bones and ends up looking like a clown. Around the same time, Vidal tries to give Tabita permission to go watch the performance since it's her last night as a normal person, but she refuses and tells him to save his pity for someone else. Much later, Saito takes the stage to keep the soldiers entertained, and while he also starts praying they don't attack him, Luis takes a break with Tefania and suddenly overhears Augusta telling Margarita that the Baron only agreed to it because she promised to get him some alone time with Luis. Margarita immediately tells her that it's a bad idea because Luis is way too skinny to defend herself from an obese creep. However, just as Augusta decides to do it herself, Luis shows up and says she is more than capable of dealing with one sleazy old fart. So Augusta hands her one of the sleeping potions and says she only has to slip a drop into his drink to knock him out. Moments later, she finds the Baron's private chamber and quickly gets into character to please him. But after pouring him a drink, she checks for the potion and gets horrified after realizing that it slipped right off her flat melons. She immediately tries to escape, but the Baron loses control of his urges and pounces. Back outside, Saito spots the sleeping potion, and after Coco falls asleep on a random crate, Tefania shows up and quickly realizes that Luis is in trouble. Thankfully, they make it there in time to save her, but the Baron quickly runs back and threatens to blow her head off if Saito comes any closer. Tefania then uses a powerful spell to reset his already damaged brain, but after eventually waking up, he instinctively remembers his love for Luis's flat chest, so she knocks him out with a kick to the face. Shortly after this, all the soldiers finally fall asleep, but as they all prepare to go save Tabita, Vidal shows up. So Augusta attacks with her fire magic and almost gets roasted alive when he deflects it back to her. After Geach and Maricorn also try to attack and nearly get sent back to God, Saito charges in with Delfinger and gets blasted away by Vidal's impenetrable shield. Luckily, Delfinger recognizes the spell he is using to create it and tells Luis to use her dispel magic. So she starts chanting the spell while Saito defends her from Vidal's attacks. As soon as she completes it and combines it with Delfinger's strength, Saito attacks again and manages to cut through the shield, but Tefania stops him from chopping Vidal's head off. After Saito reminds her that he just tried to murk everyone, she explains the teaching of love her mum passed down to her, and Louise also tells him to leave Vidal since he is no longer a threat. Saito then reluctantly drops the sword, and this causes Vidal to have a change of heart, so he tells them where to find Tabita minutes later. Tabita starts bawling her eyes out as she fears that no one really cares enough to come save her. But then they all walk into the room. Sheffield immediately tells Joseph about it, but he tells her not to worry because it's all part of the plan. In a dream much later, Louise wakes up on a patch of grass and tries to get back inside the carriage, but then she sees Saito and Tabita snuggling up to each other and loses it. However, her void magic suddenly stops working, causing her to panic until she wakes up, as she immediately heads into the woods to make sure it was just a dream. Saito spots Tabita reading a book and gets closer to ask about it. After she tells him about the main characters, he gets even closer and says he still can't read their language, so she offers to teach him. It's her way of showing gratitude for the risk he took just to save her. Moments later, Louise returns and tells him that she can't use magic again, so he suggests getting some rest because she might just be tired. She then tells him to shut the hell up because she actually can't use magic again, but then Tabita decides that she is going to become his new protector since she no longer has enough power to keep him safe. This surprises Louise since her dreams have never come true this quickly, but then Geach and Maricorn wake up and ask if they need to start running again. Meanwhile, Joseph and Sheffield get excited to see his colossal beast in action. Around the same time, Siesta gets worried about Saito and tells Colbert that she still can't see any sign of them, so he tells her to continue watching instead of getting stressed. Hours earlier, they had just heard about a suspicious plan Joseph was cooking up from Henrietta, so Colbert offered to go help but was worried that the ship's defenses would not be enough. Julio then told him about an artifact called the Great Spear and said it might finally be time to use it, so Colbert agreed to take it on the ship before Ains also decided to join the mission. Back in the carriage, Saito tries to tell Louise that he has gotten better at reading their language, but remains lost in thought about losing her powers, so he continues practicing with Tabita, who then explains that it's because of his powers. The moment she tells him that gaining full control will change him, Louise asks if he has ever noticed anything different while using his powers. He then says nothing really changes aside from his ability to control weapons, but she gets scared that he might lose his love for her. As she continues asking about it, Geach calls him to look at the border, so they all get excited to finally be back in Tristane. The next moment, Saito notices a large shadow above them and steers the carriage out of the way before Joseph, Demon Knight, lands. Once it gets up on both feet, Sheffield tells them to forget about getting out in one piece, so Tabita sends Sylphid to attack and tells Saito to stay back because they only want her. However, after she fires off a massive ice spear, the Titan Knight blocks it, and Sheffield tells her to get lost because she actually came for someone else. Geach and Augusta then try to attack as well, but the knight easily blocks it before Sheffield tells Louise to stop hiding in the carriage. Upon hearing this, Saito tells her to stay inside and runs out to fight, so Margarita and Tefania hold her back while Maricorn steers the carriage away. Despite this, Louise manages to jump out and runs to help Saito, only to get snatched up by the knight while they all watch. Saito immediately tries to save her but gets swatted away, so Tabita and Sylphid catch him while Louise starts bluffing about using her explosion magic with the hope that Sheffield will back off. The next moment, they spot Colbert's ship, so Louise decides to sacrifice herself for everyone and agrees to leave with Sheffield. However, Saito finally gets close enough to land a hit, and after the knight releases Louise, Tabita and Sylphid catch them again. Moments later, they land in front of the ship, and after taking one look at the Great Spear, which is actually a military-grade cannon, Saito uses his powers to learn everything there is to know about it. He then gives them instructions to load it up and quickly fires a shot straight into the knight's chest, but it still blocks the blast and gets even closer. Saito then tells Louise to use her Dispel skill to destroy its barrier, but she tells him that her magic still won't work. Just then, the knight reaches in to grab Saito, but Colbert and Augusta manage to hold it back, so Saito continues telling Louise to use her skill. After saying that she no longer has any power or even the right to stay with him, Louise starts bawling her eyes out, so Tabita offers to become Saito's partner instead and kisses him right in front of her. This causes Louise to flip out, but it also jumpstarts her magic, so Tabita tells her to channel her anger towards the knight. The next moment, Louise completely destroys its barrier, so Saito fires another round straight into its chest, causing it to explode in seconds. Minutes later, Sheffield returns to give Joseph a report, and while he gets excited about Louise's power, Saito hugs her in bed and tells her to stop with the master and familiar nonsense she keeps yapping about because he loves her regardless of how powerful or flat she is. After giving him a hug, she starts teasing him about the kiss with Tabita, and after he says Tabita was probably just trying to help, she pulls him in for a steamy kiss. Later on, they arrive at the palace in Tristane, so Louise apologizes to Henrietta and asks for a punishment, but Henrietta presents her with a royal mantle and names her as the official next in line to the throne. After also reinstating Saito's status as a chevalier, she welcomes Tabita back to Tristane, so they all start celebrating. Moments later, Tabita snuggles up to Saito, so Louise tries to use her explosion on him, but Sylphid quickly transforms and flies off with him. Does Joseph actually have a plan, or is he just having trouble accepting his endless failures? Comment next part to find out, and don't forget to turn on post notifications after subscribing to make sure you never miss any of our videos.